The earliest traces of what would become the Lombard people emerge from the fog-shrouded forests and windswept coasts of Scandinavia, where a Germanic tribe known as the Winili carved out their existence among the harsh landscapes of present-day southern Sweden and Denmark. Archaeological evidence from the 1st century AD revealed settlements characterized by longhouses constructed from timber and clay, their rectangular forms stretching up to 30 meters in length and housing extended family groups under single roofs supported by rows of wooden posts. These structures, excavated primarily in Scania and the Danish islands, show clear signs of livestock keeping within the same buildings where humans lived, a practical adaptation to the severe northern winters. The material culture of these early Winili settlements demonstrates sophisticated metalworking capabilities, particularly in iron production and bronze ornamentation. Grave goods from burial sites near modern Malmö include elaborately decorated belt buckles featuring intricate geometric patterns and stylized animal motifs, alongside weapons such as single-edged swords called skramus axes and leaf-shaped spearheads with pronounced central ridges. The burial practices themselves reveal a society that honoured both warriors and craftsmen, with cremation predominating but inhumation becoming increasingly common for individuals of higher status, their bodies placed in wooden chambers accompanied by personal weapons, jewellery and ceramic vessels containing food offerings. According to the legendary account preserved in the 8th century Historia Langobardorum by Paul the Deacon, the transformation of the Winili into the Langobardi occurred through divine intervention during a crucial military encounter. The tale recounts how the Winili faced the larger and more powerful Vandal confederation in battle, prompting their leaders to seek supernatural assistance. The goddess Freya, wife of Woden, advised the Winili women to arrange their long hair across their faces like beards and position themselves alongside their men at dawn when Woden would survey the battlefield from his celestial vantage point. When the god gazed eastward and observed what appeared to be a host of long-bearded warriors, he inquired about the identity of these Langobardi, or Longbeards, inadvertently naming them and, according to Germanic custom, becoming obligated to grant them victory. While this mythological narrative clearly serves to explain the tribal name and establish divine patronage, it reflects genuine cultural elements of early Germanic society, including the importance of hair as a symbol of status and the belief in active divine participation in human conflicts. The worship of Woden among the early Lombards aligns with broader Germanic religious practices documented across northern Europe, where the one-eyed god served as patron of warriors, rulers, and those who sought wisdom through sacrifice and ordeal. The archaeological record supports a gradual southward migration beginning in the late 1st century AD, with Lombard material culture appearing progressively further from Scandinavian heartlands. Distinctive pottery styles, characterized by hand-built vessels with burnished surfaces and geometric and sized decorations, begin appearing in sites along the Elbe River Valley by the early 2nd century. These ceramic traditions show clear continuity with Scandinavian prototypes, while incorporating new elements absorbed through contact with existing Germanic populations in northern Germany. Settlement patterns during this migration phase reveal a semi-nomadic lifestyle adapted to both pastoral and agricultural pursuits. Temporary camps identified through post-hole patterns and refuse deposits suggest the Lombards moved seasonally, following river valleys that provided water, fertile soil for limited cultivation, and natural highways for further movement. The presence of cattle bones in significant quantities at these sites indicates herding remained central to their economy, while iron agricultural tools suggest they practice slash-and-burn agriculture to supplement their diet with grain crops. The migration brought the Lombards into contact and conflict with established Germanic tribes, particularly the Suebi Confederation, that controlled much of the territory between the Elbe and Oder rivers. Archaeological evidence of burned settlements and weapon deposits in ritual contexts suggests these encounters were frequently violent, forcing the Lombards to develop increasingly sophisticated military organization. Warrior graves from this period contain longer swords with pattern-welded blades, indicating access to advanced metallurgical techniques and the resources necessary to equip professional fighters. The social structure that emerged during these migrations centered on the institution of the comitatus, warrior bands bound by personal loyalty to individual leaders through oaths and the exchange of gifts. These groups, typically numbering between 20 and 50 men, formed the core of Lombard military capability and served as the primary mechanism for territorial expansion. Archaeological evidence from chieftain burials reveals the material wealth that successful war leaders accumulated, including silver arm rings, imported Roman goods, and elaborate weapons decorated with gold and garnet inlays. The religious practices of the migrating Lombards remained firmly rooted in Germanic paganism, with particular emphasis on war deities and ancestral spirits. Sacred groves identified through pollen analysis and the distribution of votive offerings show continuity in worship practices despite geographical displacement. Bronze figurines depicting armed dancers and animals, found in bog deposits across the migration route, suggest ritual activities designed to ensure military success and tribal cohesion during periods of uncertainty and conflict. Burial practices evolved significantly during the migration period, reflecting both changing social structures and contact with new populations. While cremation remained common, the proportion of inhumation burials increased, particularly for individuals buried with weapons and ornaments indicating warrior status. These graves often feature the deceased positioned with weapons at their side and personal ornaments in place, suggesting beliefs about the afterlife that required material possessions for the journey to the realm of the dead. The gradual movement southward brought the Lombards into the broader sphere of Roman awareness by the mid-2nd century AD, though direct contact remained limited. Roman writers begin mentioning Germanic tribes in the regions the Lombards were entering, describing conflicts and population movements that created opportunities for expansion. The Marcomannic Wars of the 160 S and 170 SAD disrupted existing tribal boundaries and created power vacuums that mobile groups like the Lombards could exploit. By the early 3rd century, Lombard settlements had reached the Middle Elbe region, where they established more permanent bases while maintaining their essential character as a warrior society, organised around personal loyalty and martial prowess. The archaeological record from this period shows increasing sophistication in both craftsmanship and settlement organisation, with larger villages surrounded by defensive earthworks and evidence of specialised craft production, including advanced metalworking and textile manufacture. The material culture of these established settlements reveals growing wealth and social stratification, with elite burials containing imported goods from across the Germanic world and even items of Roman manufacture. Glass vessels, bronze implements, and decorative metalwork demonstrate participation in long-distance trade networks that connected the Lombards to broader European commercial systems. This economic integration would prove crucial for their later expansion, providing both the resources and knowledge necessary for more ambitious territorial conquests. The religious landscape also showed signs of evolution, with traditional Germanic practices supplemented by new ritual elements absorbed through contact with other tribes. Sacred sites from this period feature more elaborate structures and richer deposits of offerings, suggesting increased ceremonial complexity and possibly the emergence of a more organised priesthood to manage religious affairs for the growing tribal confederation. The consolidation of Lombard settlements along the Middle Elbe during the 3rd century provided the foundation for their next major territorial expansion, as pressure from eastern nomadic groups and opportunities presented by Roman frontier instability drew them toward the rich agricultural lands of the Danube basin. The movement into Pannonia represented a fundamental shift from the semi-nomadic lifestyle of their migration period to the establishment of a territorial kingdom that would dominate the region for over 2 centuries. Archaeological evidence indicates the initial Lombard penetration into Pannonian territory occurred during the late 4th century, coinciding with the broader period of Germanic migrations that Roman historians termed the barbarian invasions. Unlike the chaotic mass movements often associated with this era, the Lombard expansion into the Danube region proceeded systematically through a series of calculated military campaigns and diplomatic negotiations, with Roman authorities increasingly unable to maintain effective control over their northern frontiers. The Pannonian landscape that greeted the Lombards differed dramatically from their previous territories, featuring vast plains ideal for cavalry warfare, interspersed with river valleys that provided natural defensive positions and fertile agricultural land. Roman infrastructure, though deteriorating, still included fortified cities, stone roads, and agricultural estates that represented unprecedented wealth and sophistication compared to the timber and earthwork settlements of Germania. The province had served as a crucial buffer zone protecting Italy from northern invasions, its strategic importance reflected in the substantial military installations and veteran colonies established during the height of imperial power. The declining Western Roman Empire of the late 4th and early 5th centuries faced simultaneous pressures across multiple frontiers, forcing emperors and their generals to adopt pragmatic solutions that often involved recruiting Germanic warriors as foederati, allied troops who received land grants and subsidies in exchange for military service. The Lombards proved particularly attractive as potential allies due to their reputation as disciplined fighters and their relatively small numbers, which suggested they could be controlled and integrated into Roman defensive systems without overwhelming existing populations. The earliest documented foederati arrangements between the Lombards and Roman authorities date to the reign of Emperor Honorius, when Lombard contingents served alongside Roman legions in campaigns against other Germanic groups threatening the Danubian frontier. These initial military partnerships provided the Lombards with intimate knowledge of Roman tactical methods, organizational structures, and equipment standards that would prove invaluable in their subsequent territorial expansion. Lombard warriors adopted Roman-style mail shirts, constructed from interlocked iron rings, reinforced leather helmets with bronze fittings, and standardized spear points manufactured in Roman armories. The integration of Roman military techniques transformed Lombard warfare from the individual combat and small-scale raiding that characterized their earlier conflicts to coordinated infantry formations supported by cavalry units and siege equipment. Archaeological excavations of Lombard military camps from this period reveal systematic layouts based on Roman castra designs, with standardized tent positions, defensive ditches, and centralized command areas that enabled more effective coordination of large-scale operations. Weapon caches discovered at these sites include Roman-manufactured swords with inscribed makers' marks alongside traditional Germanic weapons, demonstrating the hybrid nature of Lombard military equipment during the transition period. The tactical innovations adopted from Roman models included the use of shield walls formed by overlapping rectangular shields reinforced with iron bosses, creating defensive formations capable of withstanding cavalry charges while maintaining offensive capability through coordinated spear thrusts and sword work. Lombard infantry learned to maneuver in organized units responding to trumpet signals and standardized commands, replacing the individual heroics and personal combat that had dominated Germanic warfare traditions. These disciplined formations proved particularly effective against other barbarian groups that retained traditional fighting methods, providing the Lombards with significant tactical advantages in territorial disputes. The complex political landscape of 5th century Pannonia required the Lombards to navigate relationships with multiple competing powers, including remnant Roman authorities, other Germanic confederations, and emerging nomadic threats from the eastern steppes. The Gepids, who who had established themselves in the eastern portions of the former province, represented the most significant immediate challenge to Lombard expansion. These related Germanic people controlled fertile agricultural territories and maintained their own feudatary relationships with Constantinople, creating a rivalry that would define much of Lombard policy for the next century. Gepid military organisation closely paralleled Lombard developments, with both groups adopting Roman equipment and tactical methods, while maintaining traditional Germanic social structures based on warrior loyalty and personal honour. The resulting conflicts combined disciplined infantry combat with the individual prowess that characterised Germanic warfare, producing battles of unprecedented scale and intensity. Archaeological evidence from the battlefield sites includes mass graves containing warriors equipped with standardised weapons and armour, suggesting engagements involving hundreds or thousands of combatants organised in formal military units. The Ostrogoths under Theodoric the Great presented a different type of challenge, as their kingdom in Italy represented both a potential threat and a possible model for Lombard political development. Theodoric's successful integration of Germanic and Roman administrative systems created a functioning state that maintained classical infrastructure while accommodating barbarian social customs and military traditions. Lombard leaders studied Ostrogothic methods carefully, sending embassies to Ravenna and maintaining diplomatic correspondence that provided insights into effective governance techniques. Relations with the Ostrogoths fluctuated between cautious cooperation and open hostility, depending on broader strategic circumstances and the personal ambitions of individual rulers. When Ostrogothic expansion threatened Lombard territories, military confrontations erupted, featuring cavalry charges across open plains and siege warfare around fortified settlements. These conflicts demonstrated the evolution of both peoples beyond simple raiding, as campaigns involved systematic territorial conquest, the establishment of garrison forces, and the administration of captured populations through appointed governors and tribute systems. The emergence of Avar power in the mid-6th century introduced a new dynamic to Pannonian politics, as these nomadic warriors brought military techniques and organisational methods derived from the eastern steppes. Avar cavalry, equipped with composite bows and trained in rapid manoeuvre warfare, posed challenges that neither Roman nor Germanic tactical systems had been designed to address. The Lombards found themselves forced to develop new defensive strategies, including the construction of fortified camps with multiple defensive lines and the training of their own mounted archers to counter Avar mobility advantages. The Avar threat also created opportunities for Lombard expansion, as other Germanic groups sought alliances against the common enemy. These coalitions provided the Lombards with additional military resources while establishing their reputation as reliable allies, capable of honouring treaty obligations. The diplomatic skills developed during these negotiations would prove essential for later Lombard expansion into Italy, where complex political relationships required sophisticated understanding of alliance systems and power balances. King Audoin's reign marked the culmination of Lombard consolidation in Pannonia, as he successfully unified the various tribal groups under centralised royal authority, while maintaining the warrior traditions that formed the basis of Lombard identity. Audoin's court, established at a fortified settlement near modern Budapest, combined Germanic customs with Roman administrative practices, creating a hybrid system that efficiently managed territorial expansion while preserving tribal loyalty structures. The royal administration developed during Audoin's reign included appointed dukes who governed specific territories while maintaining personal armies loyal to the king. These dukes, drawn from prominent warrior families, received land grants and tribute rights in exchange for military service and administrative responsibilities. The system balanced royal authority with traditional Germanic concepts of personal honour and warrior independence, creating a stable foundation for territorial expansion without triggering internal rebellions. Audoin's military reforms standardised equipment and training across Lombard forces, while preserving the elite warrior bands that formed the core of royal power. Professional soldiers received regular pay in addition to shares of plunder from successful campaigns, creating incentives for military service that attracted warriors from throughout the Germanic world. The Royal Guard, composed of sworn companions bound by personal oaths to the king, served as both an elite military unit and a training ground for future military leaders. The economic foundations of Alduin's kingdom rested on a combination of agricultural production, craft manufacturing, and tribute extraction from conquered territories. Lombard settlements in Pannonia featured substantial agricultural estates worked by a combination of free farmers, semi-free dependents, and enslaved captives from military campaigns. The fertile Danubian plains supported grain production that exceeded subsistence requirements, generating surpluses that could support professional military forces and fund territorial expansion. Craft production under Alduin's reign achieved levels of sophistication that rivaled contemporary Roman and Byzantine workshops, with Lombard metalworkers producing weapons and ornaments that combined Germanic artistic traditions with classical technical methods. Archaeological evidence from royal workshops includes elaborate jewellery featuring cloison enamel work, pattern-welded sword blades with complex geometric designs, and bronze vessels decorated with intricate animal motifs that reflected both Christian and pagan religious symbolism. The death of King Alduin in 565 AD brought his son Alboin to the Lombard throne at a moment when the carefully constructed balance of power in Pannonia faced unprecedented challenges. The Avar Confederation, having consolidated control over the Hungarian plains east of the Danube, began exerting increasing pressure on Germanic settlements throughout the region. These nomadic warriors, led by their Kargan Bayan, possessed military capabilities that surpassed anything the Lombards had previously encountered, combining the mobility of steppe cavalry with sophisticated siege techniques learned from Byzantine and Persian conflicts. Avar military superiority became evident through a series of devastating raids that penetrated deep into Lombard territory, targeting agricultural settlements and craft workshops that formed the economic foundation of Alduin's kingdom. The nomadic warriors employed coordinated cavalry formations armed with powerful, composite bows capable of penetrating Germanic mail armour at distances exceeding 200 metres. Their tactics emphasised rapid movement and concentrated firepower, allowing relatively small Avar forces to overwhelm larger Germanic infantry formations before disappearing into the vast plains that provided natural sanctuary. The Gepid Confederation, traditional rivals of the Lombards in Pannonian politics, found themselves equally vulnerable to Avar expansion. King Cunimund of the Gepids attempted to organise a defensive coalition including the Lombards, but deep-seated animosities and territorial disputes prevented effective cooperation. Archaeological evidence from this period reveals the construction of numerous fortified refuges throughout Gepid territory, hilltop settlements surrounded by multiple defensive walls and equipped with underground storage chambers for extended sieges. These preparations proved insufficient against Avar mobility and tactical innovation. The decisive confrontation between the Gepids and Avars occurred in 567 AD, when Cunimund's forces met Bayan's cavalry in a pitched battle near the Tisza River. Contemporary Byzantine sources describe the engagement as a catastrophic defeat for the Gepids, with their infantry formations shattered by repeated cavalry charges, supported by concentrated archery. Cunimund himself fell in the fighting, and Alboin reportedly claimed the dead king's skull as a drinking cup, following ancient Germanic customs that transformed defeated enemies into symbols of victory and supernatural power. The destruction of Gepid resistance left the Lombards as the sole significant Germanic power in Pannonia, but this apparent triumph actually intensified their strategic predicament. Avar expansion now focused entirely on Lombard territories, while the elimination of the Gepid buffer zone exposed Lombard settlements to direct nomadic pressure. Alboin recognised that his forces, despite their discipline and Roman-influenced organisation, could not indefinitely resist Avar military superiority in the open plains, where nomadic cavalry held decisive advantages. Intelligence reports reaching Alboin's court described the devastating impact of the Gothic Wars on Byzantine Italy, where decades of conflict between imperial forces and Ostrogothic armies had reduced much of the peninsula to ruins. The wars, which concluded in 553 AD with the defeat of the last Ostrogothic king Teia, had depopulated vast regions and destroyed the administrative infrastructure that had maintained Roman rule for centuries. Byzantine garrisons, concentrated primarily in fortified coastal cities, exercised minimal control over the interior territories, where abandoned farmlands and ruined settlements offered opportunities for systematic colonization. The strategic situation in Italy appeared particularly favourable for invasion when considered alongside the broader military commitments facing the Byzantine Empire under Emperor Justin II. Imperial forces were simultaneously engaged in conflicts with Sassanid Persia along the eastern frontier, suppressing Slavic incursions across the Danube and defending North African territories against Berber raids. The Italian garrison, commanded by the Exarch of Ravenna, numbered fewer than 15,000 professional soldiers, supplemented by local militia units of questionable reliability and loyalty. Alboin's decision to abandon Pannonia and invade Italy represented a calculated response to these converging pressures, but the magnitude of such an undertaking required extensive preparation and diplomatic coordination. The Lombard king negotiated agreements with various tribal groups throughout the Germanic world, offering shares of anticipated plunder and territorial grants in exchange for military participation in the Italian expedition. These negotiations attracted Saxons from northern Germany, Gepid survivors seeking revenge against their Avar conquerors, Bulgars displaced by nomadic expansion, and numerous smaller tribal contingents motivated by prospects of wealth and land. The resulting confederation assembled at Lombard strongholds in Pannonia during the spring of 568 AD represented one of the largest Germanic military forces organised since the Great Migrations of the previous century. Contemporary estimates suggest the expedition included approximately 100,000 participants, though only a fraction of this number consisted of active warriors. The majority comprised families, craftsmen, slaves, and livestock that would form the foundation of permanent settlement in conquered territories. The logistical challenges of moving such a massive population across the Alps required careful planning and advanced preparation. Lombard scouts had spent months identifying viable routes through mountain passes, establishing supply depots and negotiating agreements with local populations who might otherwise resist the passage of armed groups. The main invasion force followed the traditional route through the Predal Pass, a challenging but well-established pathway that had been used by previous Germanic invaders and Roman armies moving between Italy and the Danubian provinces. The initial phase of the invasion proceeded with remarkable speed and efficiency, as Byzantine frontier defences proved inadequate to contain the Lombard advance. The fortress of Cividale del Friuli, strategically positioned to control the Alpine approaches, fell after a brief siege when its garrison recognised the impossibility of effective resistance. The capture of this stronghold provided the Lombards with their first major base in Italian territory and demonstrated the vulnerability of Byzantine defensive preparations. Alboin's military strategy emphasised rapid territorial expansion rather than prolonged sieges of heavily fortified positions, recognising that his diverse coalition forces required constant success to maintain cohesion and morale. The Lombard army advanced in multiple columns that could converge for major engagements while covering maximum territory during the conquest phase. This approach prevented Byzantine forces from concentrating for effective counterattacks, while ensuring that Lombard control extended throughout conquered regions, rather than being limited to isolated strongholds. The systematic nature of Lombard conquest became evident in their treatment of captured cities and the administrative arrangements established in occupied territories. Unlike the destructive raids that characterized many Germanic incursions, the Lombard invasion aimed at permanent settlement and the establishment of functional governance systems. Captured Roman officials who demonstrated competence and loyalty were retained in administrative positions, while Lombard nobles received territorial grants that balanced reward for military service with the practical requirements of regional administration. The Siege of Aquileia, one of the most important cities in northeastern Italy, demonstrated the evolution of Lombard military capabilities since their arrival in Pannonia. The city's massive walls, constructed during the height of Roman power and reinforced during the Gothic Wars, presented formidable defensive challenges that required sophisticated siege techniques. Lombard engineers employed Roman-style siege equipment, including battering rams, scaling ladders, and catapults operated by specialists recruited from various tribal contingents with experience in fortress warfare. The fall of Aquileia after several weeks of siege warfare sent shockwaves throughout Byzantine Italy and established Lombard reputation for military effectiveness against fortified positions. The city's capture provided enormous quantities of plunder, including gold, silver, weapons, and manufactured goods that were distributed among the coalition forces according to predetermined agreements. More importantly, the victory demonstrated that major Roman cities could be taken through systematic siege warfare, encouraging further territorial expansion throughout the Po Valley. The Lombard advance toward Milan, the traditional capital of northern Italy, encountered minimal Byzantine resistance as imperial forces concentrated their limited resources in defensible coastal positions, rather than attempting to contest control of the interior plains. Local populations, exhausted by decades of warfare and uncertain governance, often welcomed Lombard rule as preferable to the chaos and taxation that had characterized recent Byzantine administration. Rural communities particularly benefited from Lombard policies that emphasized agricultural production and local security over the tribute extraction that had dominated imperial governance. The capture of Milan in late 569 AD represented the culmination of the initial invasion phase and established Lombard control over the economic heartland of northern Italy. The city's workshops and trading networks provided access to Mediterranean commercial systems, while its agricultural hinterland offered the productive capacity necessary to support permanent settlement. Alboin established his temporary capital in Milan, using the city's administrative infrastructure to organize the governance of conquered territories while planning the next phase of territorial expansion. The systematic organization of conquered territories reflected the administrative experience gained during the Pannonian period, as Lombard nobles received ducal appointments that combined military command with civilian governance responsibilities. These dukes established fortified residences in major cities while maintaining mobile forces capable of responding to Byzantine counterattacks or local rebellions. The ducal system balanced centralized royal authority with regional autonomy, allowing effective administration of diverse territories while preserving the warrior traditions that formed the foundation of Lombard identity. The integration of diverse tribal groups within Lombard military organization required careful attention to traditional customs and leadership structures that motivated participation in the Italian expedition. Saxon contingents maintained their distinctive weapons and fighting techniques while accepting overall Lombard command authority. Gepid survivors received territorial grants that acknowledged their royal heritage while incorporating them into the expanding Lombard kingdom. Bulgarian and other nomadic groups provided cavalry capabilities that complemented Germanic infantry formations in combined operations against Byzantine forces. The adaptation to Mediterranean warfare conditions necessitated significant modifications in traditional Germanic military practices, as the Italian climate, terrain, and urban environment presented challenges different from those encountered in northern European conflicts. Lombard warriors learned to fight effectively in the intense heat of Italian summers, modifying their equipment and tactics to maintain combat effectiveness under conditions that had previously been unfamiliar. The prevalence of fortified cities required greater emphasis on siege warfare and urban combat techniques that differed substantially from the open-field battles that had characterized Germanic warfare traditions. The conquest of Pavia in 572 AD marked another crucial milestone in Lombard territorial expansion, as this strongly fortified city controlled key river crossings and trade routes throughout the Po Valley. The siege lasted for 3 years, demonstrating both Byzantine determination to retain strategic positions and Lombard persistence in systematic conquest. The prolonged nature of the siege allowed both sides to develop innovative military techniques, with the Byzantines employing Greek fire and other incendiary weapons, while the Lombards constructed elaborate siege works, including tunnels and mobile towers. The successful capture of Pavia provided the Lombards with their permanent capital, a decision that reflected both strategic considerations and symbolic importance. The city's location offered excellent defensive advantages while maintaining access to the river systems that facilitated communication and transportation throughout Lombard territories. The establishment of the royal court at Pavia created an administrative centre that could effectively coordinate the governance of the expanding kingdom, while serving as a symbol of Lombard power and permanence in Italian affairs. The assassination of King Alboin in Verona during 572 AD created an immediate crisis that threatened to fragment the newly established Lombard kingdom. The king's death resulted from a conspiracy involving his wife Rosamund, daughter of the slain Gepid king Cunimund, and Helmichis, a prominent Lombard nobleman who had served as the royal armour-bearer. The murder occurred during a feast when Alboin, reportedly intoxicated, forced Rosamund to drink from her father's skull, an act that triggered the revenge plot that cost him his life. The circumstances surrounding Alboin's assassination revealed the tensions inherent in the diverse coalition that had conquered northern Italy, as traditional Germanic concepts of honour and revenge conflicted with the practical requirements of territorial administration. Rosamund's participation in the conspiracy reflected both personal motivation for avenging her father's death and broader Gepid resentment at their subordinate position within the Lombard kingdom. The involvement of Lombard nobles suggested internal political divisions that had developed during the conquest period. The immediate aftermath of the assassination witnessed a period of political instability that contemporary sources termed the rule of the dukes, as no single leader possessed sufficient authority to claim the royal throne. The various dukes who governed Lombard territories maintained their regional power, while avoiding commitments to central authority that might compromise their independence. This fragmentation threatened to undo the territorial gains achieved during the invasion, as Byzantine forces recognized opportunities to exploit Lombard disunity through coordinated counterattacks. The political vacuum created by Alboin's assassination found temporary resolution when the Lombard dukes selected Cleef, a prominent military commander from the Bavarian contingent, as their new king in 574 AD. Cleef's elevation to the throne represented a compromise between competing factions within the Lombard nobility, as his relatively neutral position among the various tribal groups that comprised the Italian expedition made him acceptable to leaders who might have opposed candidates with stronger regional ties or personal ambitions. His brief reign, lasting only 18 months until his own assassination in 575 AD, demonstrated the fragility of royal authority in the newly established kingdom and the persistent tensions between centralized monarchy and ducal independence. During his short rule, Cleef attempted to consolidate Lombard territorial gains through systematic elimination of remaining Byzantine administrative structures and local Roman elites who might serve as focal points for imperial restoration efforts. Contemporary sources describe widespread executions of Roman senators, municipal officials, and wealthy landowners throughout Lombard-controlled territories, actions that removed potential opposition while transferring substantial properties to Lombard nobles and their followers. These confiscations provided the economic foundation for the ducal system that would dominate Lombard governance for the next decade, as territorial grants enabled regional commanders to maintain independent military forces without relying on royal resources. The assassination of Clef in 575 AD precipitated the period that Lombard chroniclers termed the rule of the dukes, a decade-long interregnum during which no single ruler claimed the royal title while regional commanders exercised autonomous authority within their respective territories. This decentralized system emerged from practical necessity rather than constitutional design, as the various dukes recognized that royal succession disputes might trigger civil wars that would benefit Byzantine forces seeking to reclaim lost provinces. The arrangement allowed each duke to focus on consolidating control within his own domain, while maintaining loose coordination with neighbouring Lombard territories for mutual defence against external threats. The 36 dukes who governed Lombard territories during this period established their courts in major cities throughout northern and central Italy, creating regional capitals that combined military headquarters with administrative centres. The Duke of Friuli maintained his seat at Cividale, controlling the crucial Alpine passes through which the original invasion had proceeded, and serving as the primary defence against potential Avar incursions from Pannonia. The Duke of Trento commanded the western Alpine approaches, while overseeing the integration of local populations in the mountainous regions where Roman authority had always been tenuous. The Duke of Spoleto extended Lombard influence into central Italy, establishing a southern stronghold that threatened Byzantine communications between Rome and Ravenna. The most significant of these ducal establishments was the Duchy of Benevento, founded by Duke Zotto around 571 AD in the strategic city that controlled access routes between central and southern Italy. Benevento's position allowed the Lombards to project power throughout the Italian Peninsula, while maintaining independence from both Byzantine coastal enclaves and the emerging Lombard kingdom in the north. The duchy's military forces included substantial cavalry contingents recruited from nomadic groups that had participated in the original invasion, providing mobility advantages in the mountainous terrain that characterized much of central Italy. The ducal period witnessed significant military innovations as regional commanders adapted their forces to local conditions and strategic requirements. The Duke of Bergamo developed specialized mountain warfare techniques for operations in the Alpine foothills, training infantry units in rapid movement across difficult terrain and the construction of fortified positions that could control valley passages. The Duke of Brescia focused on cavalry development, recognizing that control of the Po Valley's open plains required mobile forces capable of rapid response to Byzantine counterattacks or internal rebellions. The absence of central authority during the ducal period paradoxically strengthened Lombard military capabilities, as individual commanders competed to demonstrate their effectiveness through successful territorial expansion and defensive victories. This competition drove tactical innovation and encouraged the recruitment of specialists from throughout the Mediterranean world, including Byzantine deserters who brought knowledge of imperial military techniques and siege warfare methods. The dukes also recruited extensively among local Italian populations, offering military service as a pathway to integration within Lombard society for Romans willing to abandon their previous allegiances. The economic foundations of ducal power rested on systematic exploitation of captured Roman estates and urban properties, which provided both agricultural production and craft manufacturing capabilities. The dukes distributed confiscated lands among their followers according to traditional Germanic principles that balance reward for military service with obligations for continued loyalty and military availability. These grants created a warrior aristocracy bound to ducal authority through personal oaths and material dependence, establishing social structures that would persist throughout the Lombard kingdom's existence. The administrative systems developed by individual dukes combined Germanic customs with Roman legal and bureaucratic traditions, creating hybrid institutions that could effectively govern diverse populations while maintaining warrior values and military readiness. The Duke of Milan retained Roman tax collection methods, while modifying assessment criteria to favour agricultural production over commercial activities. The Duke of Pavia established legal procedures that recognised both Germanic customary law and Roman jurisprudence, allowing disputes to be resolved according to the ethnic identity and cultural preferences of the parties involved. The religious landscape during the ducal period remained predominantly Arian Christian, reflecting the theological traditions that the Lombards had adopted during their Pannonian sojourn through contact with Ostrogothic missionaries and clergy. Arian Christianity, which denied the full divinity of Christ while maintaining his subordinate relationship to God the Father, had become the dominant form of Christianity among Germanic peoples during the 4th and 5th centuries. Lombard Arianism included distinctive liturgical practices conducted in Gothic rather than Latin, theological interpretations that emphasized the warrior aspects of Christian virtue, and ecclesiastical structures that subordinated religious authority to secular political control. The persistence of Arian Christianity among the Lombards created significant diplomatic obstacles in their relationships with both the Byzantine Empire and the Roman Papacy, as Orthodox Christian authorities viewed Arianism as a dangerous heresy that threatened fundamental doctrinal principles. Byzantine emperors, who claimed authority as protectors of Orthodox Christianity, used Lombard Arianism as justification for military campaigns aimed at reconquering Italian territories. The Pope, whose authority in central Italy faced direct Lombard pressure, consistently opposed Arian expansion while seeking Orthodox Christian allies who might contain Germanic influence. The growing instability of the ducal system became apparent during the late 570s, as individual commanders pursued increasingly independent policies that threatened the cohesion of Lombard rule in Italy. The Duke of Spoleto initiated unauthorized campaigns against papal territories, creating diplomatic crises that provided Byzantine forces with opportunities for intervention. The Duke of Benevento established direct diplomatic relations with Constantinople, suggesting potential defection from Lombard unity in exchange for imperial recognition and support. The northern dukes engaged in territorial disputes among themselves, weakening collective defence capabilities against potential Frankish intervention from beyond the Alps. The crisis deepened when Frankish armies under King Childebert II invaded northern Italy in 584 AD, exploiting Lombard disunity to reclaim territories that the Franks claimed as rightful inheritance from their earlier interventions in Italian affairs. The Frankish invasion demonstrated the military vulnerabilities created by political fragmentation, as individual dukes proved unable to coordinate effective resistance against a unified external threat. The capture of several Lombard strongholds and the devastation of agricultural territories throughout the Po Valley convinced the ducal assembly that restoration of royal authority had become essential for survival. The selection of Athari as king in 584 AD marked the end of the ducal interregnum and the beginning of systematic efforts to consolidate Lombard authority throughout Italian territories under centralized royal control. Athari, son of the murdered King Clef, possessed legitimate claims to royal succession while maintaining sufficient distance from factional disputes to serve as an acceptable compromise candidate. His elevation required significant concessions to ducal autonomy, as the regional commanders demanded guarantees that royal restoration would not eliminate their territorial authority or reduce their military independence. The negotiations that produced Athari's coronation established constitutional principles that would define Lombard governance for the remainder of the kingdom's existence, balancing royal prerogatives with ducal rights in ways that preserved both central coordination and regional flexibility. The king retained authority over foreign policy, military coordination during major campaigns, and the appointment of new dukes when vacancies occurred through death or deposition. The dukes maintained control over their territorial administration, local military forces, and the distribution of lands within their jurisdictions, creating a federal system that accommodated both Germanic traditions of warrior independence and the practical requirements of governing diverse Italian populations. Othari's reign witnessed the beginning of gradual religious transformation that would fundamentally alter Lombard relationships with both their Italian subjects and neighbouring Christian powers. The king's marriage to Theodelinda, a Bavarian princess who practiced Orthodox Catholic Christianity, represented a calculated diplomatic initiative designed to improve relations with the Frankish kingdoms while maintaining Lombard independence from Byzantine political influence. Theodelinda's Orthodox faith and her influence within the royal court created opportunities for Catholic missionaries to establish connections with Lombard nobles who had previously been isolated within Arian religious communities. The religious conversion process proceeded gradually and unevenly throughout Lombard territories, reflecting both genuine theological conviction and practical political considerations that varied according to local circumstances and individual preferences. The royal court's adoption of Catholic practices encouraged similar conversions among nobles seeking to demonstrate their loyalty to the crown, while ducal courts in regions with significant Roman populations found that religious conformity facilitated administrative cooperation and reduced resistance to Lombard authority. The process was complicated by the persistence of Germanic pagan traditions among rural populations and military units that maintained traditional warrior religious practices alongside Christian observances. Queen Theodelinda's patronage of Catholic monasteries and churches provided institutional foundations for the expansion of Orthodox Christianity throughout Lombard territories, as royal donations funded the construction of religious buildings and the support of clergy who could conduct missionary activities among both Lombard and Roman populations. The Queen's establishment of the monastery of Bobbio, under the Irish monk Columbanus, created an important centre of learning and religious activity that attracted scholars and missionaries from throughout Western Europe. These monastic foundations served as focal points for cultural exchange between Germanic and Roman traditions, while providing educational opportunities that enhanced administrative capabilities within the Lombard kingdom. The codification of Lombard law under King Rothari in 643 AD represented the culmination of legal development that had begun during the ducal period, as regional commanders had found it necessary to establish systematic procedures for resolving disputes between Germanic and Roman populations with different legal traditions and cultural expectations. The Edict of Rothari, comprising 388 individual laws organised according to subject matter, create a comprehensive legal framework that balanced Germanic customary practices with Roman jurisprudential principles, while accommodating the practical requirements of governing diverse populations. The legal code established detailed procedures for resolving disputes through monetary compensation rather than blood vengeance, reflecting both Christian influences that discourage violence and practical considerations that sought to maintain social stability within territories containing potentially hostile populations. The Wergild system, which assigned specific monetary values to individuals according to their social status and ethnic identity, provided mechanisms for compensating victims of violence while avoiding the cycle of retaliatory killings that had characterized traditional Germanic justice. The code recognized distinctions between Lombards, Romans, and slaves, while establishing procedures that allowed legal disputes to be resolved according to the ethnic identity of the parties involved. The territorial expansion that occurred during the reigns of Othari and his successors demonstrated the military effectiveness of the restored royal authority, as coordinated campaigns achieved conquests that had been impossible during the period of ducal fragmentation. The systematic conquest of Liguria provided the Lombards with access to Mediterranean trade routes, while eliminating Byzantine strongholds that had threatened communications between northern and central Italian territories. The capture of Genoa and other Ligurian ports gave Lombard merchants direct access to maritime commercial networks that connected Italy with North Africa, Spain, and the Eastern Mediterranean. The establishment of the southern duchies of Spoleto and Benevento as permanent components of the Lombard kingdom required careful diplomatic and military coordination that balanced regional autonomy with royal authority. These duchies maintained significant independence due to their geographic separation from the northern kingdom and their strategic importance as buffers against Byzantine expansion from southern Italy. The Dukes of Spoleto and Benevento received extensive territorial grants and military resources while acknowledging royal supremacy and providing military assistance during major campaigns against external enemies. The administrative integration of conquered territories proceeded through systematic policies that combined Germanic institutional structures with Roman bureaucratic methods, creating hybrid systems that could effectively govern populations with diverse cultural backgrounds and legal traditions. Royal officials appointed to oversee territorial administration included both Lombard nobles and Roman administrators who possessed the technical expertise necessary for tax collection, judicial procedures, and commercial regulation. These mixed administrative teams facilitated communication between Germanic rulers and Roman subjects, while ensuring that governance policies reflected both practical efficiency and political loyalty. The economic development that accompanied territorial consolidation transformed the Lombard kingdom from a military confederation focused on plunder and tribute extraction into a functioning state capable of supporting complex administrative structures and professional military forces. Agricultural production increased through the systematic cultivation of abandoned lands and the introduction of improved farming techniques that combined Germanic agricultural methods with Roman engineering capabilities. Urban manufacturing recovered as Lombard craftsmen learned Roman production techniques while maintaining traditional Germanic artistic styles and metalworking skills. The diplomatic relationships that developed between the Lombard kingdom and neighbouring powers reflected the gradual transformation from a barbarian invasion force into a legitimate European monarchy capable of conducting sophisticated international relations. The marriage alliances established with Frankish and Bavarian royal families created networks of mutual obligation and support that enhanced Lombard security, while providing access to broader European political developments. The religious conversion to Catholic Christianity facilitated diplomatic communications with Orthodox Christian rulers, while reducing the ideological barriers that had previously isolated the Lombards from Western European political systems. The accession of Liutprand to the Lombard throne in 712 AD marked the beginning of the most prosperous and expansive period in the kingdom's history, as the new king inherited a realm that had achieved remarkable stability under his predecessors, while possessing the military strength and administrative sophistication necessary for unprecedented territorial expansion. Liutprand's 32-year reign would witness the Lombard kingdom reach its greatest geographical extent, stretching from the Alpine passes in the north to the approaches of Rome in the south, while simultaneously experiencing a cultural renaissance that produced architectural innovations, artistic achievements, and scholarly developments that rivaled contemporary Frankish and Byzantine accomplishments. The military campaigns that defined Liutprand's early reign demonstrated the evolution of Lombard warfare from the tribal raiding that had characterized the initial conquest of Italy to sophisticated strategic operations involving coordinated infantry and cavalry formations, supported by advanced siege equipment and systematic logistical planning. The king's first major offensive, launched against the Byzantine Exarchate of Ravenna in 713 AD, employed multiple army columns that advanced simultaneously along different routes to prevent imperial forces from concentrating their limited resources for effective resistance. Lombard engineers constructed portable siege towers mounted on wheeled platforms that could be rapidly assembled at fortress walls, while specialised units of crossbowmen provided covering fire that suppressed defensive archery and allowed assault troops to approach fortified positions with reduced casualties. The capture of Comacchio in 715 AD provided the Lombards with their first significant naval base, as the strategic port controlled access to the Po River Delta and the maritime trade routes that connected northern Italy with Byzantine territories in the eastern Mediterranean. Lombard naval forces, initially composed of captured Byzantine vessels manned by Italian sailors who had transferred their allegiance to the expanding kingdom, began conducting systematic raids against imperial shipping while protecting Lombard merchant vessels that carried Italian agricultural products and manufactured goods to markets throughout the Mediterranean basin. The development of indigenous shipbuilding capabilities at Comacchio and other captured ports enabled the Lombards to construct specialised warships designed for both river operations and coastal warfare, featuring shallow drafts that allowed navigation in the complex waterways of the Po Delta while mounting catapults and ballistae for siege operations against fortified harbours. The systematic conquest of the Pentapolis, the 5 Byzantine cities of Rimini, Pesaro, Fano, Senigallia, and Ancona, represented the culmination of Liutprand's eastern expansion and demonstrated the sophisticated coordination between land and sea forces that characterized mature Lombard military operations. The campaign began with cavalry raids that isolated each city from potential reinforcement, while Lombard naval forces established blockades that prevented supplies and communications from reaching the besieged garrisons. The Siege of Ancona, which lasted for 8 months during 728-729 AD, showcased innovative siege techniques, including the construction of artificial harbours that allowed Lombard ships to maintain close blockades despite winter storms, while underground tunnels enabled assault troops to approach the city walls without exposure to defensive fire from the towers and ramparts. The territorial expansion achieved during these campaigns provided the Lombard kingdom with unprecedented economic resources, as the captured cities controlled vital trade routes and possessed manufacturing capabilities that complemented the agricultural production of the Po Valley. The port facilities at Ancona handled commercial traffic between Italy and the eastern Mediterranean, generating customs revenues that funded further military expansion while providing access to luxury goods, raw materials, and technical knowledge from throughout the Byzantine Empire. The workshops of Ravenna, renowned for their production of silk textiles, ivory carvings, and illuminated manuscripts, continued operating under Lombard patronage while adapting their artistic styles to incorporate Germanic motifs and Christian symbolism that reflected the cultural synthesis occurring throughout the kingdom. The diplomatic complexities created by Lombard expansion required Liutprand to navigate carefully between competing pressures from the Papacy, the Byzantine Empire, and the Frankish kingdoms, each of which possessed the military capability to threaten Lombard territorial gains if provoked beyond acceptable limits. The king's relationship with Pope Gregory II exemplified these diplomatic challenges, as papal territories in central Italy found themselves increasingly surrounded by Lombard conquests, while the Pope required Lombard military support against Byzantine attempts to enforce imperial religious policies that contradicted Roman Catholic doctrine. The iconoclastic controversy, which erupted when Emperor Leo III ordered the destruction of religious images throughout the Byzantine Empire, created opportunities for Lombard papal cooperation against imperial authority while simultaneously generating tensions over territorial control in central Italy. The marriage alliance negotiated between Liutprand and the Bavarian ducal family in 716 AD demonstrated the sophisticated diplomatic strategies employed by the Lombard court to secure northern frontiers while gaining access to alpine trade routes that connected Italy with the emerging commercial networks of Central Europe. The Bavarian connection provided the Lombards with intelligence regarding Frankish military preparations and political developments, while offering potential refuge for Lombard nobles in the event of military disasters or succession crises. The alliance also facilitated the recruitment of Bavarian craftsmen and scholars who contributed to the cultural development occurring within Lombard territories, particularly in the fields of metalworking, manuscript illumination, and architectural design. The architectural achievements of Liutprand's reign reflected both the economic prosperity generated by territorial expansion and the cultural confidence that accompanied military success, as Lombard builders developed distinctive architectural styles that combined Germanic structural techniques with Roman engineering principles and Byzantine decorative elements. The reconstruction of the royal palace at Pavia, begun in 720 AD, featured innovative vaulted halls supported by alternating columns and piers that created spacious interior spaces suitable for royal ceremonies and administrative functions, while incorporating defensive elements that reflected the continuing military nature of Lombard kingship. The palace complex included specialized workshops for royal craftsmen, treasury chambers protected by multiple defensive barriers, and residential quarters that could accommodate the extended royal household and visiting dignitaries from throughout Europe. The monastery of San Salvatore at Brescia, founded under royal patronage in 723 AD, exemplified the architectural innovations that characterized Lombard religious construction during this period. The church features a distinctive westwork with twin towers flanking the main entrance, creating an imposing facade that announced the power and piety of its royal patrons, while providing defensive capabilities that reflected the uncertain security conditions in contested frontier regions. The interior decoration combined traditional Germanic geometric patterns executed in stone carving with Byzantine-influenced mosaic work that depicted biblical scenes and royal portraits, creating a visual synthesis that represented the cultural complexity of Lombard Christian identity. The development of distinctive Lombard sculptural styles during Liutprand's reign produced stone carvings that achieved unprecedented artistic sophistication while maintaining the warrior themes and animal motifs that reflected Germanic cultural traditions. The sculptural program at the Church of Santa Maria in Valle at Cividale, executed between 725 and 730 AD, featured relief panels depicting armed saints and royal figures that combined classical proportional systems with Germanic stylistic preferences for intricate surface decoration and symbolic representation. The famous Tempietto Longobardo, at the same site, represented the pinnacle of Lombard architectural achievement, with its sophisticated stucco decoration featuring intertwined vine scrolls, geometric patterns, and figural representations that demonstrated mastery of both Roman decorative traditions and contemporary Byzantine artistic techniques. The economic foundations of Lombard cultural achievement rested on systematic exploitation of the kingdom's strategic position along major European trade routes, as Alpine passes under Lombard control carried increasing volumes of commercial traffic between northern European markets and Mediterranean trading centres. The development of Lombard coinage during this period reflected both the kingdom's economic sophistication and its political aspirations, as royal mints at Pavia, Milan and Lucca produced gold solidi and silver denarii that met international standards for weight and purity, while featuring royal portraits and Christian symbols that proclaimed Lombard legitimacy and religious orthodoxy. The standardization of weights and measures throughout Lombard territories facilitated commercial development, while generating tax revenues that funded military expansion and cultural patronage. The agricultural innovations introduced during Liutprand's reign transformed the productivity of Italian farmlands through systematic application of advanced farming techniques and the introduction of new crops that increased both yield and nutritional value. The three-field system, adopted from Frankish agricultural practices, allowed more intensive cultivation of available land while maintaining soil fertility through crop rotation that included nitrogen-fixing legumes. The construction of extensive irrigation networks in the Po Valley utilised Roman engineering principles to create canal systems that brought water from alpine rivers to previously unproductive lands, enabling the cultivation of rice and other water-intensive crops that provided dietary diversity and export opportunities. The urban development that accompanied economic growth created commercial centres throughout Lombard territories that served as focal points for craft production, trade, and cultural exchange between Germanic and Roman populations. The expansion of Milan during this period included the construction of new residential districts outside the ancient Roman walls, featuring houses built according to Germanic architectural principles that emphasized extended family accommodation and workshop spaces for craft production. The development of specialized craft quarters within major cities created concentrations of skilled artisans who could collaborate on complex projects while maintaining the competitive relationships that drove technical innovation and artistic achievement. The legal developments that occurred during Liutprand's reign built upon the foundation established by the Edict of Rothari, while addressing the increasingly complex legal questions that arose from territorial expansion and cultural integration. The king's legal pronouncements, preserved in contemporary documents, demonstrate sophisticated understanding of jurisprudential principles that balance Germanic customary law with Roman legal traditions and Christian moral teachings. The establishment of royal courts with jurisdiction over disputes involving multiple ethnic groups required judges who possessed knowledge of diverse legal traditions while maintaining loyalty to Lombard political authority and Christian religious principles. The educational institutions that developed under royal patronage created opportunities for scholarly achievement that attracted intellectuals from throughout Western Europe, while preserving and transmitting the cultural heritage of both Germanic and Roman civilizations. The school established at the monastery of Bobbio under Abbot Attila produced manuscripts that combined Irish scholarly traditions with Lombard artistic styles, creating illuminated books that achieved international recognition for their technical excellence and aesthetic innovation. The Royal Library at Pavia assembled collections of classical texts, Christian theological works, and Germanic historical chronicles that provided resources for scholars engaged in historical research and legal studies. The diplomatic correspondence preserved from Liutprand's court reveals the sophisticated international relationships that the Lombard kingdom maintained with powers throughout Europe and the Mediterranean, demonstrating the kingdom's emergence as a major player in early medieval politics. The king's negotiations with Caliph Hisham ibn Abd al-Malik regarding commercial arrangements and prisoner exchanges show Lombard participation in the broader Mediterranean political system that included both Christian and Islamic powers. The treaties concluded with various Slavic tribes along the eastern Alpine frontiers established buffer zones that protected Lombard territories while creating opportunities for cultural exchange and commercial development. The military innovations that characterized Liutprand's later campaigns reflected continuous adaptation to changing tactical requirements and technological developments, as Lombard forces incorporated new weapons and techniques learned through contact with diverse enemies and allies. The development of specialized cavalry units equipped with stirrups and improved saddles enhanced Lombard mobility and shock capability, while maintaining the disciplined infantry formations that had proven effective in siege warfare and defensive operations. The recruitment of Arab and Byzantine military engineers provided access to advanced siege techniques, including Greek fire, and improved catapult designs that increased the effectiveness of Lombard fortress operations. The cultural synthesis achieved during Liutprand's reign created distinctive Lombard contributions to European civilization that influenced artistic and intellectual development throughout the medieval period, as Germanic warrior traditions merged with Roman administrative sophistication and Christian spiritual values to produce innovations in law, art, architecture, and governance. The Lombard legal tradition influenced the development of medieval jurisprudence throughout Europe, while Lombard architectural styles provided models for church construction in regions far beyond the kingdom's political boundaries. The scholarly achievements of Lombard monasteries contributed to the preservation of classical learning and the development of new educational methods that would shape European intellectual life for centuries. The territorial extent achieved by the end of Liutprand's reign encompassed virtually all of northern and central Italy, except for the immediate environs of Rome and the coastal enclaves that remained under Byzantine control, creating a unified Italian kingdom that had not existed since the fall of the Western Roman Empire. The administrative systems developed to govern these extensive territories combined efficiency with flexibility, allowing local populations to maintain their cultural traditions while accepting Lombard political authority and contributing to the kingdom's military and economic strength. The success of this administrative integration demonstrated the evolution of Lombard governance from simple military occupation to sophisticated statecraft that could accommodate diverse populations while maintaining political unity and military effectiveness. The death of Liutprand in 744 AD marked not only the end of the Lombard kingdom's golden age, but also the beginning of a series of escalating conflicts that would ultimately lead to the destruction of Lombard independence. His successor, Hildeprand, ruled for only a few months before being overthrown by Ratchis, Duke of Friuli, whose brief reign demonstrated the internal instability that had begun to plague the kingdom despite its territorial achievements and cultural sophistication. The political uncertainty that characterized these rapid succession changes coincided with the emergence of new external pressures that would prove far more dangerous than any previous threats faced by the Lombard monarchy. The most immediate challenge confronting Ratchis involved the deteriorating relationship with the Papacy, as Pope Zachary had grown increasingly concerned about Lombard territorial expansion toward Rome and the kingdom's control over strategic positions that could potentially isolate the papal capital from Byzantine support. The Pope's correspondence with Frankish rulers during this period reveals growing anxiety about Lombard military capabilities and territorial ambitions, particularly following their successful conquest of the Exarchate of Ravenna's outlying territories and their establishment of permanent garrisons within striking distance of Rome itself. These papal concerns were exacerbated by reports of Lombard raids against monasteries and churches in contested border regions, actions that violated the religious neutrality that had previously characterized Lombard papal relations. The internal divisions within the Lombard nobility became increasingly apparent during Ratchis's reign, as different factions pursued conflicting policies regarding territorial expansion and religious affairs. The northern dukes, particularly those controlling territories along the Alpine frontiers, favoured continued expansion against Byzantine positions while maintaining traditional Lombard independence from external interference. The central Italian dukes, whose territories bordered papal lands, recognised the diplomatic advantages of accommodation with Rome, while pursuing their own territorial ambitions in regions where papal authority remained weak or contested. These competing perspectives created policy inconsistencies that undermined the kingdom's strategic coherence and provided opportunities for external powers to exploit Lombard internal divisions. Ratchis's decision to abdicate the throne in 749 AD and enter monastic life at Monte Cassino reflected both personal religious conviction and recognition of the insurmountable political challenges facing the Lombard monarchy. His withdrawal from secular authority brought Aistulf, Duke of Friuli, to the throne at a moment when decisive leadership was essential for maintaining Lombard territorial gains and addressing the growing external threats that endangered the kingdom's survival. Aistulf's accession represented the triumph of the aggressive expansionist faction within the Lombard nobility, as the new king had consistently advocated for renewed military campaigns against both Byzantine and papal territories despite the diplomatic risks such policies entailed. The military campaigns that Aistulf launched immediately after his coronation demonstrated both the continued effectiveness of Lombard military organisation and the strategic miscalculations that would ultimately prove fatal to the kingdom's independence. The systematic conquest of the remaining Byzantine strongholds in the Exarchate of Ravenna, completed between 751 and 752 AD, eliminated the last significant imperial presence in northern Italy while providing the Lombards with complete control over the Adriatic coast and its vital commercial networks. The capture of Ravenna itself, after a siege lasting several months, represented the culmination of centuries of Lombard expansion against Byzantine authority and seemed to confirm the kingdom's emergence as the dominant power in Italian affairs. The siege of Ravenna showcased the sophisticated military techniques that Lombard forces had developed through decades of experience in fortress warfare, as engineers employed multiple siege towers constructed from prefabricated components that could be rapidly assembled at different points along the city's extensive fortifications. Lombard catapults, operated by specialists recruited from throughout the Mediterranean world, maintained continuous bombardments that prevented effective repairs to damaged wall sections while creating breaches that assault troops could exploit. The coordination between land and naval forces during the siege demonstrated the evolution of Lombard military capabilities beyond their traditional strengths in infantry combat, as ships blockaded the harbour while cavalry units controlled the surrounding countryside to prevent relief expeditions from reaching the besieged garrison. The administrative arrangements established in conquered Ravenna revealed Aistulf's intentions to create a unified Italian kingdom under Lombard authority, as the captured city became the seat of a new duchy responsible for governing the extensive territories that had previously comprised the Byzantine Exarchate. The appointment of Lombard nobles to key administrative positions eliminated the dual loyalty problems that had complicated governance in regions with mixed populations, while the retention of experienced Roman bureaucrats ensured continuity in tax collection and commercial regulation. The integration of Ravenna's silk workshops and manuscript scriptoriums into the broader Lombard economic system provided new sources of revenue and cultural prestige that enhanced the kingdom's international reputation. The success of the Ravenna campaign encouraged Aistulf to pursue even more ambitious territorial goals, as the elimination of Byzantine resistance in northern Italy seemed to demonstrate that no external power possessed the military capability to challenge Lombard expansion effectively. The king's decision to demand tribute from Rome itself, announced through formal diplomatic communications in 752 AD, represented a fundamental escalation in Lombard territorial ambitions that threatened to upset the delicate balance of power that had previously allowed the papacy to maintain independence from both Lombard and Byzantine authority. The tribute demand included not only monetary payments, but also territorial concessions that would have placed Rome under direct Lombard political control, while reducing papal authority to purely spiritual matters. Pope Stephen II's response to Aistulf's demands demonstrated the sophisticated diplomatic strategies that the papacy had developed for dealing with threats to its temporal authority, as the Pope recognised that neither Byzantine military support nor local Roman resistance could effectively counter Lombard military superiority. The papal decision to seek assistance from the Frankish kingdom represented a calculated gamble that would fundamentally alter the political landscape of Western Europe while creating precedents for papal secular cooperation that would influence European politics for centuries. The Pope's journey across the Alps in 754 AD to meet personally with King Pepin the Short marked the first time a reigning pontiff had travelled beyond Italian territories, demonstrating the desperate nature of papal concerns about Lombard territorial expansion. The negotiations between Pope Stephen and Pepin at the royal palace of Pantheon produced agreements that established new principles for the relationship between secular and religious authority, while creating military obligations that would ultimately prove fatal to Lombard independence. The Frankish kings promised to protect papal territories and restore lands conquered by the Lombards, reflected both genuine religious conviction and calculated political interest in expanding Frankish influence into Italian affairs. The papal recognition of Pepin's royal legitimacy, including the ceremonial anointing that confirmed divine sanction for his usurpation of Merovingian authority, created reciprocal obligations that bound both parties to mutual support against common enemies. The theological justifications developed for Frankish intervention in Italian affairs drew upon biblical precedents and patristic writings that established principles of Christian kingship, requiring secular rulers to protect the church against hostile forces. Pope Stephen's letters to Pepin, preserved in contemporary collections, employed sophisticated theological arguments that portrayed Lombard territorial expansion as an attack against God himself, requiring Christian rulers to respond with military force to defend the faith. These religious justifications provided moral legitimacy for Frankish military intervention, while creating precedents for papal appeals to secular powers that would influence medieval European politics throughout the subsequent centuries. The military preparations undertaken by Pepin for his Italian campaigns demonstrated the logistical sophistication that characterized mature Frankish military organization, as the king assembled forces drawn from throughout his kingdom while coordinating with papal agents who provided intelligence regarding Lombard defensive preparations and potential Italian allies. The Frankish army that crossed the Alps in 754 AD included substantial cavalry contingents equipped with stirrups and improved weapons that provided significant tactical advantages over traditional Lombard infantry formations. Frankish engineers brought specialized siege equipment including mangonels and ballistae that could breach fortifications more effectively than the older catapults employed by Lombard forces. The initial Frankish invasion encountered surprisingly effective Lombard resistance, as Aistulf had used the diplomatic negotiations to strengthen his defensive positions while recruiting additional military forces from throughout the kingdom. The Lombard strategy emphasized defense of strategic mountain passes and fortified positions rather than open-field battles where Frankish cavalry superiority might prove decisive. The siege of Susa, which controlled the crucial Alpine approaches, lasted for several weeks as Lombard defenders employed innovative defensive techniques, including the use of Greek fire against Frankish siege equipment and the construction of multiple defensive lines that forced attackers to overcome successive obstacles. The eventual Frankish breakthrough at Susa demonstrated both the effectiveness of their siege techniques and the limitations of Lombard defensive capabilities when facing enemies with superior resources and logistical support. Frankish engineers succeeded in undermining a crucial section of the fortress walls through tunneling operations that collapsed the foundations beneath one of the main towers, creating a breach that assault troops could exploit despite determined Lombard resistance. The capture of the fortress opened the Alpine passes to Frankish invasion, while demonstrating to other Lombard strongholds the futility of prolonged resistance against superior siege capabilities. The advance of Frankish forces toward Pavia forced Aistulf to abandon his territorial conquests and concentrate his remaining military resources for the defence of the Lombard capital, as the loss of strategic positions throughout northern Italy had eliminated the buffer zones that might have delayed enemy approach to the kingdom's political centre. The systematic Frankish conquest of Lombard strongholds demonstrated the effectiveness of coordinated siege warfare supported by adequate logistical systems, as Frankish forces maintained their operational tempo despite the challenges of campaigning in unfamiliar territory far from their supply bases. The capture of Turin, Asti, and other major Lombard cities provided Frankish forces with secure bases for continued operations, while denying the Lombards potential refuge positions. The siege of Pavia in 754 AD revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of Lombard military organisation when confronting a technologically superior enemy with greater resources and international support. Aistulf's defensive preparations included the construction of additional fortifications around the city's perimeter and the stockpiling of supplies sufficient for extended resistance, while diplomatic efforts sought to negotiate terms that might preserve Lombard independence despite military defeat. The Lombard garrison, composed of elite warriors drawn from throughout the kingdom, demonstrated exceptional courage and tactical skill in defending their positions against repeated Frankish assaults supported by advanced siege equipment. The diplomatic resolution of the first Frankish invasion, achieved through negotiations that required Aistulf to restore conquered papal territories while paying substantial tribute to Pepin, represented a temporary solution that failed to address the fundamental conflicts that had precipitated the crisis. The Lombard king's compliance with Frankish demands reflected recognition of military realities rather than genuine acceptance of the new political arrangements, as evidenced by his immediate efforts to rebuild military capabilities and seek allies who might support renewed territorial expansion. The papal recovery of territories around Rome and Ravenna provided only temporary security, as Lombard military forces remained intact and capable of renewed aggression once Frankish armies withdrew beyond the Alps. The resumption of Lombard territorial expansion under Aistulf's renewed campaigns in 756 AD demonstrated both the persistence of Lombard territorial ambitions and the inadequacy of diplomatic solutions that failed to address underlying strategic conflicts. The Second Siege of Rome, initiated by Lombard forces in 756 AD, employed more systematic siege techniques than previous campaigns while demonstrating improved coordination between different military units operating around the city's extensive perimeter. Lombard engineers constructed elaborate siege works that included multiple lines of circumvallation designed to prevent relief forces from reaching the besieged city while maintaining pressure on the defensive walls through continuous bombardment. The papal appeal for renewed Frankish intervention, delivered through urgent diplomatic communications that emphasized the desperate nature of Roman resistance, succeeded in convincing Pepin to undertake a second Italian campaign despite the logistical challenges and political risks involved in repeated military expeditions beyond the Alps. The Frankish king's decision to honour his previous commitments to papal protection reflected both religious conviction and strategic recognition that Lombard control of Rome would eliminate papal independence while potentially creating a unified Italian kingdom capable of challenging Frankish interests throughout Western Europe. The second Frankish invasion of 756 AD proceeded more rapidly than the previous campaign, as Frankish forces could utilise the strategic positions and supply bases established during their earlier operations, while benefiting from improved intelligence regarding Lombard defensive capabilities and tactical preferences. The systematic reduction of Lombard strongholds throughout northern Italy demonstrated the cumulative effects of repeated military defeats, as garrison commanders increasingly recognised the futility of prolonged resistance against superior Frankish siege capabilities. The psychological impact of continued military failures undermined Lombard morale while encouraging defections among nobles, who sought to preserve their territorial holdings through accommodation with Frankish authority. The final siege of Pavia in 756 AD culminated in Aistulf's complete capitulation and the establishment of Frankish hegemony over Lombard territorial policies, as the defeated king was forced to accept terms that effectively reduced the Lombard kingdom to Frankish client status while guaranteeing papal territorial independence. The donation of Pepin, which formally transferred control of conquered territories to papal authority, created the foundation for the papal states while establishing precedents for the temporal authority of the Church that would influence European politics throughout the medieval period. The territorial arrangements concluded at Pavia represented a fundamental shift in Italian political organisation that eliminated Lombard independence while creating new power relationships between secular and religious authority. The death of Aistulf in 756 AD, reportedly from injuries sustained during a hunting accident, created a succession crisis that further weakened Lombard resistance to external pressure while providing opportunities for Frankish intervention in internal Lombard affairs. The competing claims of Desiderius, Duke of Tuscany, and Ratchis, the former king who had emerged from monastic retirement, reflected the factional divisions that had plagued the kingdom throughout its final decades. The eventual triumph of Desiderius, achieved through a combination of military force and diplomatic manoeuvring that included promises of cooperation with Frankish interests, brought to the throne a ruler whose policies would ultimately precipitate the final destruction of Lombard independence. King Desiderius's early reign witnessed attempts to restore Lombard military capabilities and territorial authority through careful diplomacy that sought to avoid direct confrontation with Frankish power while gradually rebuilding the kingdom's strategic position. The king's marriage alliances with Bavarian and other Germanic noble families reflected efforts to create international support networks that might counterbalance Frankish hegemony, while internal reforms aimed to strengthen royal authority and improve military organisation. These initiatives demonstrated both the persistence of Lombard territorial ambitions and the fundamental constraints imposed by Frankish military superiority and papal opposition to renewed Lombard expansion. The gradual deterioration of Lombard-Frankish relations during Desiderius's reign reflected the inherent instability of political arrangements that had failed to resolve the underlying conflicts between Lombard territorial ambitions and papal independence under Frankish protection. The king's support for papal opponents and his interference in Roman ecclesiastical affairs violated the spirit, if not the letter, of previous agreements while demonstrating continued Lombard aspirations for control over central Italian territories. These provocative policies provided Charlemagne, who had succeeded his father Pepin as Frankish king, with justifications for renewed military intervention that would ultimately eliminate Lombard independence entirely. The marriage alliance between Charlemagne and Desiderius's daughter Desiderata, concluded in 770 AD, represented a temporary diplomatic solution that both rulers hoped might resolve their conflicts while preserving their respective territorial interests. The marriage reflected Lombard hopes that family connections might moderate Frankish hostility, while providing Charlemagne with potential influence over Lombard policies through his wife's family relationships. The arrangement satisfied neither party's fundamental objectives, however, as evidenced by Charlemagne's repudiation of his Lombard wife within a year of the marriage ceremony, an action that eliminated diplomatic restraints on renewed military confrontation. The final crisis that precipitated Charlemagne's decisive intervention in Italian affairs emerged from Desiderius's support for the sons of Charlemagne's deceased brother Carloman, who had sought refuge at the Lombard court after their father's death had eliminated their claims to Frankish royal succession. The Lombard king's attempts to secure papal recognition for these Carolingian princes represented a direct challenge to Charlemagne's authority while threatening to create alternative sources of legitimacy for opposition to his rule. The papal refusal to cooperate with Lombard policies, followed by Desiderius's military pressure against Rome, created the immediate justification for Frankish military intervention that would end Lombard independence forever. The destruction of the Lombard kingdom in northern Italy following Charlemagne's conquest of Pavia in 774 AD did not mark the complete end of Lombard political independence, as the southern duchies of Benevento and Spoleto had maintained sufficient autonomy from royal authority to survive the collapse of the northern monarchy. Prince Arecus II of Benevento, who had married Adelperga, daughter of the last Lombard king Desiderius, found himself the de facto leader of Lombard resistance to Frankish domination while controlling territories that encompassed much of southern Italy, from the Abruzzi Mountains to the approaches of Byzantine Calabria. The geographic isolation of these southern territories, separated from Frankish-controlled regions by the Papal States and difficult mountain terrain, provided natural defensive advantages that enabled continued Lombard independence despite the overwhelming military superiority that had eliminated their northern counterparts. Heraclius recognized that survival required fundamental changes in both political organization and diplomatic strategy, as the traditional Lombard reliance on military expansion and territorial conquest had proven inadequate against the coordinated opposition of Frankish armies and papal diplomacy. The prince initiated systematic efforts to transform Benevento from a subordinate duchy within the Lombard kingdom into an independent principality capable of conducting autonomous foreign policy, while maintaining the cultural and legal traditions that distinguished Lombard society from their Byzantine, Frankish, and Arab neighbours. These institutional reforms included the establishment of a permanent capital at Benevento itself, the creation of administrative systems that could function without external supervision, and the development of military forces specifically adapted to the defensive requirements of southern Italian terrain. The construction of the Palazzo di Arecis in Benevento during the late 770s demonstrated both the prince's commitment to permanent independence and his understanding of the symbolic importance of architectural magnificence in establishing political legitimacy. The palace complex, built according to Lombard architectural traditions, but incorporating Byzantine decorative elements and Arab engineering techniques, featured massive stone walls that could serve defensive purposes while providing suitable settings for the ceremonial activities that reinforced princely authority. The Great Hall, capable of accommodating several hundred nobles and their retainers during formal assemblies, included throne arrangements that emphasized the prince's royal aspirations while maintaining the warrior traditions that remained central to Lombard identity. The administrative innovations implemented by Heraclius created governmental structures that balanced princely authority with the traditional rights of Lombard nobles, while accommodating the diverse populations that inhabited southern Italian territories. The prince appointed counts to govern specific regions within the principality, granting them substantial autonomy in local affairs, while requiring military service and tribute payments that supported the central government's defensive capabilities. These territorial arrangements recognized the practical limitations of centralized control in mountainous regions where communications remained difficult, while ensuring that local commanders possessed sufficient resources to resist external threats without becoming independent of princely authority. The legal system developed under Heraclius combined traditional Lombard law with Roman jurisprudential principles and Byzantine administrative practices, creating hybrid institutions that could effectively govern populations with diverse cultural backgrounds and legal traditions. The prince's legal pronouncements, preserved in contemporary documents, demonstrate sophisticated understanding of the complexities involved in ruling territories that included Lombard warriors, Roman landowners, Greek-speaking communities in Calabria, and various other ethnic groups that had settled in southern Italy during the centuries of political instability. The judicial procedures established during this period allowed disputes to be resolved according to the cultural preferences of the parties involved, while maintaining overall consistency in legal principles and enforcement mechanisms. The economic foundations of Beneventan independence rested on systematic exploitation of the principality's strategic position along major trade routes connecting northern Europe with the eastern Mediterranean, as merchant caravans travelling between Frankish territories and Byzantine ports necessarily passed through Lombard-controlled mountain passes and river valleys. The prince established custom stations at key points along these routes, generating revenues that funded military expenses while providing incentives for commercial development throughout the principality. The agricultural productivity of the fertile valleys around Benevento and Salerno supported substantial populations while producing surpluses that could be traded for manufactured goods and military equipment from throughout the Mediterranean world. The military organisation that emerged under Arachis reflected both traditional Lombard warrior culture and the specific defensive requirements of southern Italian terrain, as the prince recognised that conventional infantry tactics would prove inadequate against the diverse enemies that threatened Beneventan independence. Lombard forces developed specialised capabilities for mountain warfare, training units in rapid movement across difficult terrain and the construction of fortified positions that could control strategic passes and river crossings. The recruitment of local populations, including Greeks from Calabria and Samnite descendants from the central mountains, provided knowledge of regional geography and tactical techniques adapted to specific environmental conditions. The establishment of Salerno as an alternative centre of Lombard power occurred during the early 780s, when Arichis recognised that a single capital might prove vulnerable to siege warfare, while multiple power centres would complicate enemy strategic planning and provide refuge in case of military disasters. The prince's decision to develop Salerno as a rival to Benevento reflected both practical military considerations and political calculations designed to balance competing factions within the Lombard nobility. The coastal location of Salerno provided access to maritime trade networks and potential naval support from various Mediterranean powers, while its distance from the main Frankish invasion routes offered additional security against northern threats. The cultural renaissance that flourished in the Beneventan Principality during the late 8th and early 9th centuries demonstrated the creative potential unleashed by political independence and economic prosperity, as Lombard patrons supported artistic and intellectual achievements that rivaled contemporary developments in the Carolingian Empire and Byzantium. The scriptorium established at the monastery of Santa Sofia in Benevento produced illuminated manuscripts that combined traditional Germanic artistic motifs with Byzantine iconographic traditions and Islamic geometric patterns, creating distinctive visual styles that influenced manuscript production throughout southern Europe. The Beneventan script developed during this period featured characteristic letter forms that remained recognisable for centuries, providing evidence of the cultural distinctiveness that survived political fragmentation. The architectural innovations that characterised Beneventan religious construction during this period reflected the principality's position at the intersection of diverse cultural traditions, as Lombard builders incorporated structural techniques and decorative elements from throughout the Mediterranean world while maintaining the essential characteristics of Germanic architectural preferences. The Church of Santa Sofia, reconstructed under Arichis' patronage, featured a distinctive star-shaped plan that combined Byzantine centralised design principles with Lombard longitudinal arrangements, creating interior spaces that accommodated both traditional Germanic worship practices and the liturgical requirements of Orthodox Christianity. The sculptural decoration of the church included capitals carved with intricate geometric patterns and stylized animal figures that demonstrated the continued vitality of Lombard artistic traditions. The fragmentation of southern Lombard territories into competing principalities began during the early 9th century, as the sons and successors of Arechis pursued independent policies that reflected both personal ambitions and the practical difficulties of governing extensive territories from single administrative centres. The establishment of Capua as a separate principality around 815 AD resulted from territorial disputes between different branches of the Lombard nobility, as competing claimants to Beneventan succession created permanent divisions that weakened overall Lombard resistance to external pressure. The Prince of Capua controlled strategic positions along the Volturno River valley that provided access to central Italian territories, while maintaining sufficient military strength to resist subordination to either Benevento or external powers. The political relationships between Benevento, Salerno and Capua fluctuated between cooperation and open warfare depending on external threats and internal dynastic considerations, as each principality pursued policies designed to maximize its own territorial control and commercial advantages while maintaining sufficient Lombard unity to resist foreign domination. These inter-princely conflicts often involved complex alliances with external powers, including Byzantines, Arabs, and various Italian city-states, that provided military support in exchange for territorial concessions or commercial privileges. The resulting diplomatic arrangements created a constantly shifting balance of power that prevented any single Lombard principality from achieving hegemony over the others, while maintaining collective independence from external control. The Byzantine Empire's renewed interest in southern Italian affairs during the 9th century created both opportunities and challenges for the Lombard principalities, as imperial forces sought to reclaim territories that had been lost during previous centuries, while the Lombards required external support against Arab expansion from Sicily and North Africa. The complex negotiations between Lombard princes and Byzantine officials produced military alliances that provided imperial troops for specific campaigns while granting the Byzantines temporary control over strategic positions and commercial privileges in Lombard ports. These arrangements reflected the pragmatic diplomacy that characterized southern Italian politics during this period, as all parties recognized the mutual benefits of cooperation despite fundamental conflicts over territorial control and political authority. The Arab invasions that began in the mid-9th century introduced a new dynamic to southern Italian politics, as Muslim forces from Sicily and North Africa possessed military capabilities that surpassed those of any previous enemies faced by the Lombard principalities. The Arab conquest of Bari in 847 AD established a permanent Muslim presence on the Italian mainland that threatened all Christian powers in the region while demonstrating tactical innovations that combined traditional Arab cavalry techniques with siege warfare methods learned from Byzantine and Persian conflicts. The Lombard response to this threat required unprecedented cooperation between the competing principalities, as individual princes recognized that divided resistance would prove inadequate against coordinated Muslim expansion. The military campaigns that characterized Lombard-Arab conflicts during the late 9th century showcased the tactical adaptations that both sides developed in response to their enemies' capabilities, as traditional warfare methods proved inadequate for the complex strategic environment of southern Italy. Lombard forces learned to employ rapid cavalry raids that could strike Arab positions before disappearing into familiar mountain terrain, while Arab commanders developed siege techniques specifically designed to overcome the hilltop fortifications that protected Lombard settlements. The resulting conflicts combined elements of conventional warfare with guerrilla tactics that reflected the geographic and cultural complexity of the contested territories. The Siege of Salerno in 872 AD represented the high point of Arab expansion in southern Italy, as Muslim forces commanded by the Aghlabid Emir Ibrahim ibn Ahmad assembled the largest army yet deployed on the Italian mainland for a systematic conquest of the most important Lombard stronghold. The siege lasted for several months, as Arab engineers employed sophisticated siege equipment, including mangonels and Greek fire projectors that could breach stone fortifications while maintaining pressure on multiple sections of the city's defensive perimeter simultaneously. The Lombard defence, coordinated by Prince Guaifer of Salerno, demonstrated remarkable tactical innovation in developing countermeasures against Arab siege techniques, including the construction of inner defensive lines that could continue resistance even after outer walls had been breached. The eventual Lombard victory at Salerno resulted from a combination of determined defensive resistance and external intervention by Byzantine naval forces that broke the Arab blockade, while providing supplies and reinforcements that enabled continued resistance. The defeat of the Arab siege army marked the beginning of Muslim withdrawal from mainland Italian territories, as the logistical difficulties of maintaining large forces far from their Sicilian bases proved insurmountable when faced with coordinated Christian resistance. The success of the Salerno defence enhanced Lombard military reputation throughout Europe, while demonstrating the continued viability of independent Christian resistance to Muslim expansion. The Norman arrival in southern Italy during the early 11th century initially appeared to offer opportunities for Lombard advancement, as the small groups of Norman adventurers who began appearing as mercenaries in various conflicts possessed military skills that could strengthen Lombard forces while lacking the numerical strength to threaten Lombard independence directly. The employment of Norman cavalry by various Lombard princes in their conflicts with Byzantine forces and Arab raiders provided both parties with mutual benefits, as the Normans gained territorial rewards and plunder, while the Lombards acquired military capabilities that enhanced their tactical effectiveness against traditional enemies. The transformation of Norman mercenaries into territorial conquerors occurred gradually during the mid-11th century as successful military leaders like Rainulf Drengot and Robert Guiscard established permanent bases that evolved from temporary military camps into fortified strongholds controlling strategic territories. The Norman conquest of Aversa in 1030 AD created the first permanent Norman principality in southern Italy, providing a base for further expansion while demonstrating the vulnerability of existing political arrangements to determined military pressure supported by superior tactical capabilities. The systematic Norman expansion that followed employed siege warfare techniques and cavalry tactics that proved devastatingly effective against traditional Lombard defensive methods. The gradual Norman conquest of Lombard territories proceeded through a combination of military pressure and diplomatic manipulation that exploited the divisions between competing Lombard principalities while preventing effective unified resistance. Norman leaders negotiated separate agreements with individual Lombard princes that provided temporary security for some territories while isolating others for systematic conquest. The capture of Capua in 1058 AD eliminated one of the major Lombard principalities while providing the Normans with control over strategic river valleys that facilitated further expansion toward Benevento and Salerno. The siege of Benevento in 1053 AD demonstrated both the military effectiveness of Norman siege techniques and the continued resilience of Lombard defensive capabilities when properly coordinated and supplied. The city's massive fortifications, strengthened through centuries of continuous improvement, initially resisted Norman assault methods, while the garrison employed traditional Lombard tactics that had proven effective against previous enemies. The eventual Norman success resulted from their superior logistical organisation and the systematic isolation of the city from external support, rather than from any decisive tactical superiority in individual engagements. The papal involvement in Norman expansion created complex diplomatic situations that further weakened Lombard resistance, as various popes sought to balance their opposition to Norman territorial ambitions against their need for military support against other threats. The Treaty of Melfi in 1059 AD, which granted papal recognition to Norman territorial conquests in exchange for feudal homage and military service, provided legal justification for continued Norman expansion while eliminating potential papal support for Lombard independence. The diplomatic isolation that resulted from this papal policy left the remaining Lombard principalities without significant external allies capable of providing effective military assistance. The final phase of Norman conquest proceeded rapidly once the major Lombard strongholds had been systematically reduced and their defensive capabilities eliminated through prolonged siege warfare and territorial isolation. The capture of Amalfi in 1073 AD removed the last major independent ally of the Lombard principalities while providing the Normans with complete control over the coastal trade routes that had provided economic support for Lombard resistance. The systematic reduction of smaller Lombard fortresses throughout the 1070s demonstrated the overwhelming military superiority that the Normans had achieved through their combination of superior siege techniques, cavalry tactics, and logistical organisation. The fall of Salerno in 1077 AD to the forces of Robert Guiscard marked the end of independent Lombard political entities in southern Italy, as the last major Lombard principality succumbed to Norman siege warfare after months of determined resistance. Prince Gisulf's second surrender concluded more than 3 centuries of Lombard independence in southern Italy, while eliminating the final remnant of the political structures that had emerged from the Great Migration period. The Norman integration of conquered Lombard territories into their expanding kingdom created new administrative arrangements that preserved some Lombard legal traditions while subordinating all political authority to Norman feudal structures that would dominate southern Italian affairs for the remainder of the medieval period. The Norman conquest of the last Lombard principalities in southern Italy marked the end of independent Germanic political authority on the peninsula, but the institutional, cultural and social structures that had developed during 3 centuries of Lombard rule proved far more durable than the military forces that had created them. The legal traditions established through the Edict of Rothari and subsequent royal legislation continued to influence judicial procedures throughout medieval Italy. As Norman and later rulers recognised the practical advantages of maintaining established legal frameworks that local populations understood and accepted. The persistence of Lombard law alongside Roman jurisprudence created a complex legal environment that would shape Italian governance for centuries after the disappearance of Lombard political independence. The survival of Lombard legal principles within Norman administrative systems reflected both practical necessity and deliberate policy decisions by conquerors who recognised that effective governance required accommodation with existing institutional structures. Norman rulers retained Lombard legal procedures for disputes involving property rights, inheritance claims, and commercial transactions, areas where established customs had created stable expectations among local populations. The integration of Lombard and Norman legal traditions produced hybrid judicial systems that combined Germanic concepts of personal honour and monetary compensation with feudal principles of territorial jurisdiction and hierarchical obligation. Court records from the late 11th and early 12th centuries demonstrate the continued application of Lombard legal formulas in cases involving land tenure, family relationships, and craft guild regulations. The technical vocabulary of Lombard law remained embedded in Italian legal language long after political conquest had eliminated Germanic political authority, as specialised terms for legal procedures, property relationships, and judicial penalties became permanent features of medieval Italian jurisprudence. The Lombard concept of mundium, which defined the protective authority exercised by male family heads over women and dependents, continued to influence Italian family law throughout the medieval period, despite the overlay of Roman and canonical legal principles. Similarly, Lombard terminology for land tenure relationships, including distinctions between allodial property held in full ownership and beneficiary grants conditional upon service obligations, provided the foundation for feudal property law that would dominate European legal development for centuries. The preservation of Lombard legal manuscripts in monastic libraries and cathedral schools ensured the transmission of Germanic legal traditions to subsequent generations of legal scholars and practitioners who found practical value in the systematic organisation and comprehensive coverage that characterised Lombard legislation. The Edict of Rothari, with its detailed provisions for resolving conflicts through monetary compensation rather than blood vengeance, offered alternative approaches to dispute resolution that complemented Roman legal principles while addressing situations that classical jurisprudence had not anticipated. Medieval legal commentators frequently cited Lombard precedents when analysing complex cases involving multiple legal traditions, creating scholarly literature that preserved Germanic legal concepts within broader European intellectual development, the influence of Lombard legal traditions extended beyond formal court proceedings to shape the customary practices that governed daily life in medieval Italian communities, as local populations continued to follow established procedures for conducting business transactions, arranging marriages, and resolving neighbourhood disputes according to principles that had been codified during the kingdom's existence. Market regulations in northern Italian cities retained Lombard specifications for weights, measures, and quality standards that had been established to facilitate commercial development during the 7th and 8th centuries. Guild organisations adopted Lombard procedures for apprenticeship training, master certification, and dispute resolution among craftsmen, creating institutional continuity that linked medieval urban development with earlier Germanic administrative innovations. The linguistic impact of Lombard settlement proved even more enduring than legal influences, as the Germanic language spoken by the conquerors left permanent traces in the dialects and place names that would characterise northern Italian speech patterns throughout the medieval period and beyond. The Lombard language, related to other West Germanic tongues, but possessing distinctive features that had developed during the migration period and Pannonian sojourn, contributed substantial vocabulary to the emerging Romance dialects of northern Italy. These linguistic contributions were particularly significant in areas related to warfare, craftsmanship, agriculture, and social organisation, reflecting the domains where Lombard cultural influence had been most pronounced during the period of political dominance. The phonetic characteristics of Lombard speech influenced the pronunciation patterns that distinguished northern Italian dialects from their southern counterparts, as Germanic sound changes affected the development of Latin vowel systems and consonant clusters in regions where Lombard settlement had been most intensive. The Lombard tendency to reduce unstressed vowels and simplify complex consonant combinations contributed to the distinctive sound patterns that would characterise Lombard, Piedmontese and Venetian dialects throughout their historical development. These phonetic influences remained detectable in regional speech patterns centuries after the disappearance of Lombard as a spoken language, providing linguistic evidence for the depth of Germanic cultural integration within northern Italian society. The toponymic evidence for Lombard settlement patterns reveals the systematic nature of Germanic colonization throughout northern and central Italy, as place names derived from Lombard personal names, tribal designations, and descriptive terms for geographic features provide detailed information about the distribution and organisation of Lombard communities. Villages with names ending in ingo, derived from Lombard patronymic formations, cluster in areas where archaeological evidence confirms intensive Germanic settlement during the 6th and 7th centuries. Similarly, place names incorporating Lombard terms for fortifications, such as Burg and Hof, mark locations where Germanic military and administrative centres had been established during the conquest and consolidation periods. The survival of Lombard personal names within Italian nomenclature demonstrates the social integration that occurred between Germanic and Roman populations during the centuries of Lombard rule, as intermarriage and cultural exchange produced mixed communities where both naming traditions remained viable options for parents choosing names for their children. Names like Adalbert, Grimoald and Liutprand continued to appear in Italian documents throughout the medieval period, often in Latinized forms that reflected the bilingual environment of educated society. The persistence of these Germanic names among Italian noble families provides evidence for the successful integration of Lombard aristocratic lineages within the broader medieval Italian elite, as political conquest did not eliminate the social prominence of established Germanic families who adapted to changing political circumstances. The agricultural techniques and land management practices introduced by Lombard settlers contributed to the economic development that would characterise medieval northern Italy, as Germanic farming methods adapted to Mediterranean conditions produced agricultural innovations that increased productivity while supporting larger populations. The three-field system of crop rotation, brought from Germanic territories and modified for Italian climatic conditions, allowed more intensive cultivation of available land while maintaining soil fertility through systematic alternation of grain crops and legumes. The construction of irrigation networks in the Po Valley, combining Germanic engineering knowledge with Roman hydraulic techniques, created agricultural infrastructure that supported the urban development and commercial expansion that would distinguish northern Italy during the medieval period. The social structures established during Lombard rule provided institutional foundations for the communal governments that would emerge in northern Italian cities during the 11th and 12th centuries, as Germanic concepts of collective decision-making and warrior assemblies influenced the development of urban political institutions that balanced individual autonomy with collective authority. The Lombard tradition of ducal assemblies, where regional nobles gathered to discuss policy and resolve disputes, established precedents for the communal councils that would govern medieval Italian cities. The Germanic emphasis on personal oaths and contractual relationships provided conceptual frameworks for the complex alliance systems that would characterize Italian urban politics throughout the medieval period. The integration of Lombard nobility within medieval Italian aristocracy proceeded through intermarriage, territorial consolidation, and adaptation to changing political circumstances that required traditional warrior elites to develop new skills in diplomacy, commerce, and urban administration. Lombard noble families who survived the Norman conquest and subsequent political changes often retained substantial land holdings that provided economic foundations for continued social prominence, while their experience in governance and military leadership qualified them for important positions within evolving political structures. The genealogical records preserved in monastic chronicles and family archives document the persistence of Lombard aristocratic lineages throughout medieval Italian history, often in prominent roles within urban governments and ecclesiastical institutions. The architectural legacy of Lombard rule influenced the development of distinctive building styles that would characterize northern Italian construction throughout the medieval period, as Germanic structural techniques combined with Roman engineering principles to create architectural innovations that addressed both functional requirements and aesthetic preferences. The Lombard use of alternating stone and brick construction, developed during the 8th century to create visually striking building facades while utilizing available materials efficiently, became a characteristic feature of northern Italian architecture that remained popular throughout the medieval period. The distinctive Lombard church towers, with their square plans and pyramid roofs, provided models for bell tower construction that influenced ecclesiastical architecture throughout northern Europe. The urban planning principles that emerged in Lombard cities reflected Germanic concepts of community organization adapted to Mediterranean urban environments, as settlement patterns balanced defensive requirements with commercial needs while accommodating diverse populations with the different cultural traditions. The typical Lombard city featured a central fortified area containing the ducal palace and the principal church, surrounded by residential districts organized according to ethnic and occupational groupings that facilitated both social cohesion and administrative control. These urban layouts provided templates for the planned city expansion that would characterize medieval Italian urban development, as growing populations required systematic approaches to housing, sanitation, and commercial organization. The craft production techniques that developed under Lombard patronage created manufacturing capabilities that would support the commercial expansion of medieval Italian cities, as Germanic metalworking traditions combined with Roman technical knowledge to produce weapons, tools, and decorative objects that achieved international recognition for their quality and artistic sophistication. Lombard workshops in Milan, Pavia, and other major cities developed specialized techniques for producing armor, weapons, and jewelry that incorporated both Germanic artistic motifs and Mediterranean decorative elements, creating distinctive styles that influenced craft production throughout medieval Europe. The guild organisations that emerged to regulate these craft activities adopted Lombard procedures for training apprentices and maintaining quality standards, creating institutional continuity that linked medieval urban development with earlier Germanic administrative innovations. The educational institutions established under Lombard rule provided intellectual foundations for the scholarly achievements that would distinguish medieval Italian culture, as royal and ducal patronage supported schools and libraries that preserved classical learning, while encouraging new developments in law, theology, and natural philosophy. The palace school at Pavia, established during the 8th century to train administrators and clergy for royal service, created educational models that influenced the development of cathedral schools and universities throughout medieval Europe. The curriculum developed at these institutions combined traditional Germanic oral culture with Latin literary education, producing graduates who possessed both the practical skills necessary for governance and the intellectual sophistication required for scholarly achievement. The commercial networks that developed under Lombard rule created economic relationships that would support the urban prosperity of medieval northern Italy, as Germanic control of Alpine trade routes facilitated commercial exchange between northern European markets and Mediterranean trading centres. Lombard merchants established trading partnerships with Frankish, Byzantine and Arab commercial networks that provided access to luxury goods, raw materials, and technical knowledge from throughout the known world. The commercial law that developed to regulate these trading relationships combined Germanic concepts of personal honour and contractual obligation with Roman legal principles, governing property rights and dispute resolution, creating legal frameworks that would influence European commercial development throughout the medieval period. The monetary systems established by Lombard rulers provided stable currency that facilitated commercial development while demonstrating the kingdom's integration within broader European economic networks, as Lombard coins met international standards for weight and purity, while featuring distinctive designs that proclaimed royal authority and religious orthodoxy. The standardization of weights and measures throughout Lombard territories reduced transaction costs, while encouraging trade between different regions of the kingdom, creating economic integration that would persist long after political fragmentation had eliminated central authority. The commercial practices that developed during this period, including credit arrangements, partnership agreements and insurance contracts, provided institutional foundations for the banking innovations that would characterize medieval Italian commercial development. The religious institutions that flourished under Lombard patronage created cultural centres that would influence European intellectual and artistic development throughout the medieval period, as royal and noble donations supported monasteries and churches that became focal points for scholarly activity and artistic production. The monastery of Bobbio, established under Lombard royal patronage in the early 7th century, developed into one of Europe's most important centres of learning, with a library that preserved classical texts while encouraging new developments in theology, law, and natural philosophy. The artistic workshops associated with these religious institutions produced illuminated manuscripts, sculptural decorations, and metalwork that combined Germanic artistic traditions with Mediterranean stylistic influences, creating distinctive cultural achievements that would influence European artistic development for centuries. The systematic excavation of Lombard archaeological sites throughout northern and central Italy has revolutionized scholarly understanding of Germanic settlement patterns, social organization, and cultural practices during the crucial centuries when these warriors transformed from nomadic invaders into the rulers of a sophisticated medieval kingdom. The archaeological record provides tangible evidence that complements and often corrects the written sources, revealing details about daily life, economic activities, and cultural exchange that contemporary chroniclers either ignored or considered too mundane to record. The material remains discovered at major Lombard sites demonstrate the remarkable speed, with which these Germanic settlers adapted to Mediterranean conditions while maintaining their distinctive cultural identity through centuries of political and religious transformation. The excavations at Cividale del Friuli, the first major Lombard stronghold established in Italian territory, have yielded extraordinary insights into the initial phase of Germanic settlement and the gradual evolution from military camp to administrative centre. Archaeological layers dating to the immediate post-conquest period reveal temporary wooden structures built according to traditional Germanic construction techniques, featuring post and beam frameworks filled with wattle and daub that could be erected rapidly using familiar methods and locally available materials. These early buildings show clear evidence of hasty construction and frequent modification, suggesting the uncertainty that characterized the first decades of Lombard rule, when military considerations dominated all other concerns. The transition from temporary military occupation to permanent settlement becomes evident in archaeological deposits from the late 6th and early 7th centuries, as wooden structures gave way to more substantial stone buildings that incorporated Roman construction techniques while maintaining Germanic spatial arrangements and decorative preferences. The excavated remains of what appears to be a ducal residence feature massive stone foundations supporting timber superstructures with interior layouts that accommodated both the ceremonial requirements of Germanic lordship and the administrative needs of territorial governance. The building's Great Hall, measuring approximately 30 metres in length, contained a raised platform at one end where archaeological evidence suggests the placement of a throne or ceremonial seat, while side chambers provided private quarters and storage areas for the ducal household. The material culture recovered from residential contexts at Cividale reveals the gradual integration of Germanic and Roman domestic practices, as Lombard settlers adapted their traditional lifestyle to Mediterranean conditions, while maintaining cultural elements that distinguish them from their Italian subjects. Pottery assemblages from early Lombard contexts include both hand-built vessels made according to Germanic techniques and wheel-thrown ceramics produced by local Roman craftsmen, suggesting immediate economic relationships between conquerors and conquered populations. The Germanic vessels, characterized by burnished surfaces and geometric incised decorations, served specific cultural functions related to drinking ceremonies and food presentation that remained important for maintaining Lombard social identity despite territorial displacement. The metalwork discovered in Lombard archaeological contexts demonstrates the sophisticated craftsmanship that characterized Germanic material culture, as weapons, jewelry, and household implements combined advanced technical skills with artistic traditions that had developed during centuries of migration and cultural contact. Sword blades recovered from warrior graves show pattern welding techniques that create distinctive wavy patterns through the systematic manipulation of iron and steel during the forging process, producing weapons that combined practical effectiveness with visual beauty that proclaimed their owner's social status. The complexity of these metallurgical techniques required specialized knowledge and extensive training, suggesting the presence of master craftsmen who maintained traditional Germanic metal working methods while adapting to Italian raw materials and market conditions. The jewelry assemblages from female burials at Cividale provide detailed information about Lombard women's dress and social status, as elaborate brooches, necklaces, and earrings demonstrate both personal wealth and cultural affiliation through their distinctive designs and manufacturing techniques. The famous golden crosses discovered in several high-status female graves represent the pinnacle of Lombard goldsmith work, featuring intricate cloisonne decoration that incorporated garnets and coloured glass in geometric patterns that combined Christian symbolism with traditional Germanic artistic motifs. These crosses, worn as pendants or sewn onto garments, served both as religious symbols and status indicators that proclaimed their owner's conversion to Christianity, while maintaining visual connections to ancestral cultural traditions. The fibulae discovered throughout Lombard archaeological sites reveal the evolution of Germanic dress accessories from purely functional items to elaborate status symbols that communicated complex social information through their size, materials, and decorative programs. Early Lombard fibulae from Cividale retain the bow-shaped forms and animal head terminals that characterized Germanic metalwork throughout the migration period, but later examples show increasing influence from Byzantine and Mediterranean artistic traditions. The largest and most elaborate fibulae, some measuring over 20 centimeters in length and decorated with gold foil and precious stones, clearly belong to individuals of exceptional wealth and social prominence, possibly members of the ducal family or other high-ranking nobles. The excavations at Castel Seprio, a fortified settlement northwest of Milan, have provided crucial evidence for understanding Lombard military organisation and defensive strategies during the period of territorial consolidation. The site's massive stone walls, constructed using Roman masonry techniques but following Germanic defensive principles, enclosed an area of approximately 15 hectares that contained both military and civilian structures. Archaeological investigation of the wall construction has revealed multiple building phases that correspond to different periods of Lombard rule, as defensive requirements evolved in response to changing military threats and technological developments. The earliest walls, dating to the late 6th century, employed relatively simple construction methods that prioritized rapid completion over architectural sophistication, while later rebuilding campaigns incorporated more advanced engineering techniques that reflected improved resources and technical knowledge. The interior excavations at Castel Seprio have uncovered evidence for specialized craft production that supported both military requirements and luxury consumption among the Lombard elite. Metalworking areas within the fortification contained furnaces, anvils, and specialized tools for producing weapons, armor, and decorative objects, while pottery workshops supplied ceramic vessels for both utilitarian and ceremonial purposes. The presence of these production facilities within the fortified area suggests the strategic importance of maintaining craft capabilities during periods of military threat, when external supply sources might be disrupted or unavailable. The quality of objects produced at these workshops demonstrates the high skill levels achieved by Lombard craftsmen, who successfully combined traditional Germanic techniques with innovations learned through contact with Roman and Byzantine artisans. The religious architecture discovered at Castel Seprio provides exceptional evidence for the artistic achievements of Lombard Christian culture, as the Church of Santa Maria Foris Portus contains frescoes that rank among the finest examples of early medieval painting in Western Europe. The frescoes, executed during the 8th or 9th centuries, depict scenes from the infancy of Christ in a style that combines Byzantine iconographic traditions with distinctive artistic elements that may reflect Germanic aesthetic preferences. The technical quality of these paintings, particularly their sophisticated use of modelling and spatial relationships, demonstrates the presence of highly trained artists who possessed knowledge of advanced painting techniques that had been developed in the major artistic centres of the Byzantine Empire. The burial practices documented through systematic excavation of Lombard cemeteries reveal the complex process of religious and cultural transformation that occurred during the centuries of Germanic rule in Italy. Early Lombard graves from the conquest period typically contain extensive assemblages of weapons, jewellery, and personal possessions that reflect traditional Germanic beliefs about the afterlife and the need to provide the deceased with material goods for their journey to the realm of the dead. Male burials from this period commonly include complete sets of weapons comprising swords, spears, shields, and knives, along with personal ornaments such as belt buckles and brooches that indicated social status and cultural identity. Female graves contain elaborate jewellery assemblages including necklaces, earrings, brooches, and finger rings, often accompanied by domestic implements such as keys and textile working tools that reflected their roles in household management and craft production. The gradual shift from pagan to Christian burial practices becomes evident in cemetery excavations from the 7th and 8th centuries, as traditional Germanic grave goods gradually disappear while burial orientations and cemetery organisation conform to Christian requirements. The transition period reveals fascinating combinations of old and new practices, as some graves contain Christian symbols alongside traditional Germanic weapons or jewellery, suggesting the complex negotiations between ancestral traditions and new religious requirements that characterise the conversion process. The presence of small golden crosses in graves that also contain weapons indicates attempts to reconcile warrior identity with Christian faith, while the gradual reduction in grave good quantities reflects changing beliefs about the afterlife and the proper treatment of the dead. The evolution of burial practices also reflects changing social structures within Lombard society, as the elaborate warrior graves of the conquest period give way to more standardized Christian burials that emphasize spiritual rather than material wealth. However, even within Christian cemetery contexts, subtle variations in burial treatment and the occasional presence of high-status grave goods indicate the persistence of social hierarchies that have been established during the pagan period. The most prominent Christian burials often feature stone sarcophagi or elaborate tomb structures that proclaim their occupants' social status through architectural magnificence rather than portable wealth, representing a transformation in the expression of elite identity that reflected both religious conversion and adaptation to Mediterranean cultural norms. The urban archaeology conducted in major Lombard centres has revealed the systematic transformation of Roman cities under Germanic rule, as new settlement patterns emerged that balanced traditional Roman urban organisation with Germanic social and defensive requirements. Excavations in Brescia have documented the construction of new residential districts outside the ancient Roman walls, featuring building types and spatial arrangements that reflected Germanic concepts of household organisation and community structure. These suburban developments included substantial wooden halls that served as residences for extended families or warrior bands, surrounded by smaller structures that housed craft workshops, storage facilities and livestock pens that supported the economic activities of the household group. The transformation of Roman public spaces under Lombard rule reveals the adaptation of classical urban infrastructure to Germanic administrative and ceremonial needs, as forum areas were modified to accommodate assemblies of armed warriors while maintaining their function as centres of commercial and judicial activity. Archaeological evidence from Pavia shows the construction of new buildings within the ancient forum area that combined Roman architectural techniques with Germanic spatial concepts, creating structures that could serve both traditional Roman urban functions and the ceremonial requirements of Germanic kingship. The royal palace complex, partially excavated during the 20th century, reveals sophisticated planning that integrated defensive, residential and ceremonial functions within a unified architectural program that proclaimed royal authority while accommodating the practical needs of medieval governance. The commercial archaeology of Lombard cities provides detailed evidence for the economic relationships that developed between Germanic rulers and their Italian subjects, as market areas and workshop districts reveal the continuation and expansion of commercial activities under Germanic political control. Excavated shop structures in Milan show clear continuity from Roman commercial practices, with similar building types and spatial arrangements that facilitated retail trade and craft production. However, the material culture recovered from these commercial contexts shows significant changes in the types of goods produced and consumed, as Germanic preferences influenced local production while imported items from throughout Europe and the Mediterranean reflect the expansion of trade networks under Lombard rule. The development of new settlement patterns in rural areas demonstrates the systematic colonization strategies employed by Lombard administrators to establish Germanic control over agricultural territories while maximising productive capacity. Archaeological survey work in the Po Valley has identified numerous small settlements that appear to have been established during the early Lombard period, featuring building types and spatial arrangements that differ significantly from contemporary Roman rural settlements. These Germanic settlements typically consist of several large wooden halls surrounded by smaller structures and enclosed by defensive palisades, suggesting community organisation based on extended kinship groups or warrior bands that maintained collective responsibility for agricultural production and local defence. The material evidence for Lombard agricultural practices reveals the introduction of new farming techniques and crops that increased productivity while adapting Germanic agricultural knowledge to Mediterranean environmental conditions. Excavated storage facilities at rural settlements contain remains of grain varieties that had not been commonly cultivated in Italy during the Roman period, while agricultural implements recovered from these sites show modifications to traditional Roman farming tools that reflect Germanic preferences and techniques. The presence of substantial livestock pens and processing areas at many sites indicates the continued importance of animal husbandry in Lombard economic strategies, as Germanic settlers maintained their traditional emphasis on cattle and horse breeding while adapting to Italian agricultural conditions. The archaeological evidence for Lombard religious practices provides crucial insights into the complex process of Christian conversion and the persistence of traditional Germanic spiritual beliefs within officially Christian contexts. Excavated church sites from the early Lombard period often contain evidence for the reuse of pagan sacred sites, as Christian buildings were constructed over earlier Germanic temples or ritual areas that had maintained their sacred character despite religious transformation. The Church of San Salvatore in Brescia, built over what appears to have been a Germanic sacred grove, contains foundation deposits that include both Christian relics and objects that may have served ritual functions in traditional Germanic religion, suggesting attempts to maintain spiritual continuity during the conversion process. The distinctive Lombard ecclesiastical architecture that emerged during the 7th and 8th centuries demonstrates the creative synthesis of Germanic, Roman, and Byzantine building traditions that characterise Lombard Christian culture. The Church of Santa Maria in Valle at Cividale features structural innovations that combine Germanic timber framing techniques with Roman masonry construction, creating interior spaces that accommodated both traditional Germanic worship practices and the liturgical requirements of Christian services. The sculptural decoration of these churches incorporates traditional Germanic artistic motifs within Christian iconographic programs, producing distinctive visual styles that proclaimed both religious orthodoxy and cultural continuity with ancestral traditions. The archaeological investigation of Lombard craft production has revealed the sophisticated manufacturing capabilities that supported both military requirements and luxury consumption among the Germanic elite. As specialised workshops produced goods that met international standards for quality and artistic sophistication, the metalworking complex excavated at Pavia contained furnaces capable of achieving the high temperatures necessary for steel production, along with specialised tools and moulds for producing weapons, jewellery and decorative objects. The presence of raw materials from throughout Europe and the Mediterranean indicates extensive trade networks that provided access to the finest materials available, while the quality of finished products demonstrates the technical expertise achieved by Lombard craftsmen. The evidence for textile production at Lombard sites reveals both the continuation of Roman manufacturing traditions and the introduction of new techniques and decorative styles that reflected Germanic aesthetic preferences. Excavated workshop areas contain remains of specialised equipment for wool processing, including combs, spindles and loom weights that indicate the production of high-quality textiles for both local consumption and export trade. The presence of silk-working tools at several sites suggests the continuation of luxury textile production that had characterised Roman Italy. while the discovery of distinctive Germanic-style brooches and dress accessories indicates the adaptation of traditional clothing styles to Mediterranean conditions and materials. The systematic destruction of Lombard political independence through Norman conquest did not immediately translate into historical oblivion. Yet, for centuries following their defeat, the Germanic peoples who had ruled much of Italy for over 200 years remained largely forgotten in the broader narrative of European development. Medieval chroniclers, writing under Norman, Papal, and later Angevin patronage, deliberately minimize Lombard achievements, while emphasizing the barbarian nature of Germanic rule to justify the political changes that had eliminated their independence. This historiographical neglect persisted through the Renaissance, when humanist scholars focused their attention on classical antiquity and the revival of Roman cultural models, viewing the medieval period as a dark age that had interrupted the natural development of Italian civilization. The rediscovery of Lombard historical significance began during the 18th century Enlightenment, when scholars like Ludovico Antonio Muratori initiated systematic investigations of medieval Italian sources that revealed the sophisticated nature of Lombard legal, administrative, and cultural achievements. Muratori's monumental Rerum Italicarum Scriptores, published between 1723 and 1751, made available for the first time comprehensive collections of Lombard chronicles, legal documents, and administrative records that demonstrated the complexity of Germanic governance and the extent of their cultural contributions to Italian development. His editorial work revealed the Edict of Rothari as one of the most sophisticated legal codes of the early medieval period, while contemporary chronicles showed Lombard kings as effective rulers who had successfully balanced Germanic traditions with Mediterranean political requirements. The emergence of Romantic nationalism during the late 18th and early 19th centuries created intellectual conditions that favoured renewed interest in medieval Germanic peoples as ancestors of modern European nations, providing ideological frameworks that could accommodate Lombard achievements within broader narratives of national development. German scholars like Jacob Grimm and his contemporaries began investigating Germanic legal and linguistic traditions as foundations of modern European culture, while Italian intellectuals sought historical precedents for political unification that could transcend the fragmented city-state system that had characterized the peninsula since the medieval period. These parallel scholarly developments created opportunities for reassessing Lombard contributions to European civilization within contexts that emphasized continuity rather than disruption. The political upheavals that accompanied the Napoleonic Wars and their aftermath provided additional impetus for historical research that could support emerging concepts of Italian national identity, as intellectuals and political activists sought historical precedents for unified Italian governance that predated the medieval fragmentation imposed by foreign conquerors. The Lombard kingdom, which had controlled most of northern and central Italy under a single political authority, offered an attractive model for Italian unification that avoided the problematic associations with papal temporal power or foreign domination that characterized other medieval precedents. This political utility encouraged scholarly investigation of Lombard institutions and achievements that had been neglected by previous generations of historians. The Risorgimento movement of the 19th century explicitly adopted Lombard historical precedents as evidence for the viability of Italian political unification, as nationalist intellectuals like Cesare Balbo and Carlo Cattaneo argued that Germanic rule had demonstrated the natural tendency toward Italian unity that had been artificially suppressed by foreign intervention and papal temporal authority. Balbo's influential work Delle Speranze d'Italia, published in 1844, presented the Lombard kingdom as proof that Italians could successfully govern themselves under unified political institutions, while Cattaneo's historical writings emphasized the economic prosperity and cultural achievements that had characterized northern Italy under Germanic rule. These nationalist interpretations transformed Lombard history from an obscure medieval episode into a crucial component of Italian national mythology. The scholarly apparatus that emerged to support these political interpretations included systematic investigation of Lombard archaeological remains, legal documents, and linguistic influences that provided empirical evidence for Germanic contributions to Italian civilization. The establishment of professional historical societies and academic journals during the mid-19th century created institutional frameworks for rigorous scholarly research that could distinguish between reliable evidence and nationalist mythology. The Società Storica Lombarda, founded in 1873, sponsored archaeological excavations and documentary research that revealed the material foundations of Lombard cultural achievements while maintaining scholarly standards that could withstand international academic scrutiny. Archaeological investigations initiated during this period provided tangible evidence for Lombard cultural sophistication that complemented documentary sources while revealing aspects of daily life and material culture that contemporary chroniclers had not recorded. The excavation of major Lombard sites like Cividale del Friuli and Castel Seprio during the late 19th and early 20th centuries uncovered architectural remains, artistic objects, and burial assemblages that demonstrated the remarkable speed with which Germanic settlers had adapted to Mediterranean conditions, while maintaining their distinctive cultural identity. These discoveries contradicted earlier assumptions about barbarian primitiveness, while providing detailed information about Lombard social organization, religious practices, and economic activities. The development of professional medieval studies during the late 19th century brought international scholarly attention to Lombard achievements, as historians like Heinrich Brunner and Ferdinando Gabotto applied rigorous analytical methods to Germanic legal and institutional development that revealed the sophisticated nature of Lombard governance systems. Brunner's comparative studies of Germanic law demonstrated that Lombard legal innovations had influenced European jurisprudential development far beyond Italian territorial boundaries, while Gabotto's detailed investigations of Lombard administrative documents reveal the complexity of territorial organization and fiscal management that had supported the kingdom's military and cultural achievements. These scholarly contributions established Lombard studies as a legitimate field of academic investigation that attracted researchers from throughout Europe and North America. The linguistic research that accompanied these historical investigations provided additional evidence for the depth of Lombard cultural influence within Italian development, as philologists documented the extensive Germanic vocabulary that had been incorporated into northern Italian dialects during the centuries of Lombard rule. The systematic analysis of place names, personal names, and technical terminology revealed patterns of linguistic influence that corresponded closely with archaeological evidence for Germanic settlement density, providing independent confirmation of the extent and intensity of cultural exchange between conquerors and conquered populations. These linguistic studies demonstrated that Lombard influence had penetrated far deeper into Italian society than political narratives alone could reveal. The emergence of modern archaeological techniques during the early 20th century revolutionized understanding of Lombard material culture, as systematic excavation methods and scientific analysis of artifacts provided detailed information about Germanic craftsmanship, trade relationships, and technological capabilities that had not been available to earlier scholars. The discovery of elaborate metalwork in Lombard graves revealed sophisticated artistic traditions that combined Germanic stylistic preferences with Mediterranean technical knowledge, while the analysis of pottery assemblages documented the gradual integration of Germanic and Roman domestic practices over several generations of cultural contact. These archaeological findings provided empirical foundations for scholarly arguments about Lombard cultural achievements that could not be dismissed as nationalist propaganda. The scholarly consensus that emerged during the mid-20th century recognised the Lombards as crucial mediators in the transmission of classical culture to medieval Europe, as their preservation of Roman administrative techniques and legal principles had provided institutional continuity during the political disruptions that followed the collapse of imperial authority in the West. Historians like Gian Piero Bognietti and Cinzio Violante demonstrated that Lombard legal innovations had created frameworks for resolving conflicts between different cultural traditions that would influence European development throughout the medieval period. Their research revealed that Lombard success in governing diverse populations had resulted from sophisticated understanding of cultural differences rather than simple military domination. The contemporary debates that have shaped modern Lombard studies centre on fundamental questions about the extent of Germanic cultural influence versus continuity with Roman traditions in the development of early medieval Italian society. Scholars like Chris Wickham have argued that Lombard political and social structures represented fundamental breaks with Roman precedents, creating new forms of organisation that reflected Germanic cultural values and institutional preferences. This interpretation emphasises the revolutionary impact of Germanic conquest on Italian society, arguing that Lombard innovations in law, governance and social organisation created foundations for medieval European development that differed fundamentally from classical models. Alternative scholarly perspectives, represented by historians like Stefano Gaspari and Cristina La Rocca, emphasise the continuities between Roman and Lombard institutions, while acknowledging the significant modifications that Germanic rulers introduced to accommodate their cultural preferences and political requirements. These scholars argue that Lombard success resulted from their ability to adapt existing Roman administrative and legal structures rather than replacing them entirely, creating hybrid systems that combine the efficiency of classical governance with the flexibility required for ruling diverse populations. This interpretation views Lombard achievements as evolutionary developments that built upon Roman foundations rather than revolutionary breaks with classical traditions. The archaeological evidence that has emerged from recent excavations provides support for both interpretative approaches, as material remains demonstrate both continuity and change in patterns of settlement, production, and consumption during the transition from Roman to Lombard rule. The persistence of Roman building techniques and urban organisation in many contexts suggests institutional continuity that facilitated the transfer of administrative knowledge and commercial relationships, while the appearance of distinctive Germanic artefacts and burial practices indicates the maintenance of cultural identity that influenced social organisation and religious practices. The complexity of this archaeological record has encouraged more nuanced interpretations that recognise the varied nature of cultural change in different regions and social contexts. The linguistic evidence for Lombard influence has similarly supported multiple interpretative approaches, as the distribution of Germanic loanwords and phonetic influences varies significantly across different regions of Italy and different domains of vocabulary. The concentration of Lombard linguistic influences in areas related to warfare, craftsmanship and social organisation suggests that Germanic cultural impact was most pronounced in domains where Lombard expertise provided advantages over Roman precedents, while the persistence of Latin terminology in legal, religious and commercial contexts indicates continuity in areas where Roman traditions remained functionally superior. This pattern of selective cultural influence supports interpretations that emphasise adaptation rather than replacement as the primary mechanism of cultural change. The broader implications of Lombard studies for understanding early medieval European development have attracted increasing scholarly attention as historians have recognised the significance of Germanic kingdoms in preserving and transmitting classical culture during the political disruptions that followed the collapse of Roman imperial authority. The Lombard success in creating stable governance systems that could accommodate diverse populations while maintaining military effectiveness has provided models for understanding similar processes throughout post-Roman Europe. The comparative analysis of Lombard institutions with contemporary Germanic kingdoms has revealed common patterns of cultural adaptation and institutional innovation that characterize the transition from classical to medieval European civilization. The influence of Lombard legal traditions on the development of medieval European jurisprudence has received particular scholarly attention as the systematic nature of Lombard legislation and its successful integration of Germanic and Roman legal principles provided precedents for later legal developments throughout Europe. The Edict of Rothari and subsequent Lombard legal pronouncements created frameworks for resolving disputes between different cultural groups that would influence the development of canon law, feudal law, and commercial law throughout the medieval period. The scholarly analysis of these legal influences has demonstrated the extent to which Lombard innovations contributed to the institutional foundations of medieval European society. The artistic and architectural achievements of Lombard culture have gained renewed appreciation as art historians have recognized the sophisticated synthesis of Germanic, Roman, and Byzantine traditions that characterize Lombard creative production. The distinctive architectural styles that emerged in Lombard religious buildings influenced church construction throughout northern Europe, while Lombard manuscript illumination and metalwork created artistic traditions that continued to influence European decorative arts for centuries after the kingdom's political demise. These artistic achievements have provided additional evidence for the cultural sophistication that characterized Lombard society during its period of political independence. The lasting impact of Lombard civilization on Italian regional identity remains particularly evident in Lombardy itself, where historical consciousness of Germanic heritage has influenced regional political and cultural development throughout the modern period. The adoption of Lombard symbols and historical narratives by regional political movements has demonstrated the continued relevance of medieval precedents for contemporary Italian politics, while scholarly institutions in the region have maintained active research programs that continue to expand understanding of Lombard achievements and influence. This regional identification with Lombard heritage has provided institutional support for continued archaeological and historical research that has enhanced scholarly understanding of Germanic contributions to Italian development. The place of Lombard civilization within the broader narrative of European medieval history has evolved significantly as scholars have developed more sophisticated understanding of the complex processes of cultural transmission and institutional development that characterized the post-Roman period. Rather than viewing the Lombards as barbarian destroyers of classical civilization, contemporary historians recognize them as crucial mediators who preserved and adapted Roman institutional knowledge while introducing Germanic innovations that enhanced the effectiveness of medieval governance systems. This revised understanding has positioned Lombard studies within the mainstream of medieval European historiography, while acknowledging the distinctive contributions that Germanic culture made to European development. The methodological innovations that have emerged from Lombard studies have influenced broader developments in medieval historical research, as scholars have developed interdisciplinary approaches that combine documentary analysis with archaeological investigation and linguistic research to create comprehensive understanding of historical processes. The success of these methodological approaches in revealing the complexity of Lombard cultural achievements has encouraged similar interdisciplinary research programs focused on other early medieval peoples and kingdoms. The scholarly techniques developed for Lombard studies have thus contributed to broader advances in medieval historical methodology that have enhanced understanding of the entire early medieval period. The international scholarly community that has developed around Lombard studies includes researchers from throughout Europe and North America, who have contributed diverse perspectives and methodological approaches that have enriched understanding of Germanic cultural influence within European development. The collaborative research projects that have emerged from this international scholarly network have produced comprehensive studies of Lombard law, archaeology, and cultural influence that have established new standards for medieval historical research. These collaborative efforts have demonstrated the value of international scholarly cooperation in advancing understanding of complex historical processes that transcended political boundaries. The digital humanities initiatives that have emerged in recent decades have provided new tools for analysing Lombard sources and making them accessible to broader scholarly and public audiences, as online databases and digital archives have facilitated research while preserving fragile medieval documents for future generations. The digitization of Lombard legal documents, chronicles, and archaeological records has enabled sophisticated analytical techniques that have revealed patterns of cultural change and institutional development that were not apparent through traditional scholarly methods. These technological advances have opened new avenues for Lombard research while ensuring the preservation of primary sources for future scholarly investigation. The public interest in Lombard history that has emerged in recent decades reflects broader cultural trends toward appreciation of medieval heritage and recognition of the complex cultural processes that shaped modern European civilization. Museum exhibitions, popular publications, and educational programs have brought Lombard achievements to public attention while maintaining scholarly accuracy and avoiding nationalist mythology that had characterized earlier popular treatments. This public engagement has provided political and financial support for continued scholarly research while encouraging broader appreciation of medieval cultural achievements. The Lombard legacy in European history thus represents far more than the political achievements of a successful Germanic kingdom, encompassing instead a complex process of cultural synthesis that created institutional and artistic innovations that influenced European development for centuries after their political independence had been eliminated. Their success in adapting Roman governmental techniques to Germanic cultural preferences created models for medieval governance that balanced efficiency with cultural accommodation, while their legal innovations provided frameworks for resolving conflicts between diverse populations that would influence European jurisprudence throughout the medieval period. The scholarly consensus that has emerged from more than 2 centuries of research recognizes the Lombards as crucial contributors to the cultural foundations of medieval European civilization, whose achievements in law, governance, art, and social organization created lasting influences that extended far beyond their territorial boundaries and temporal existence. Their story represents one of the most successful examples of cultural adaptation and institutional innovation in European history, demonstrating the creative potential that could emerge from the encounter between different civilizational traditions when managed by leaders who possessed both military capability and cultural sophistication. The continued relevance of Lombard studies for understanding contemporary European development reflects the enduring significance of the cultural synthesis they achieved, as modern Europe continues to grapple with questions of cultural integration and institutional adaptation that the Lombards addressed with remarkable success more than a millennium ago. Their legacy thus remains not merely a subject of historical curiosity, but a source of insight into the processes of cultural change and political innovation that continue to shape European civilization in the modern era.